The desert grows quiet at 2 in the morning. That particular kind of quiet where even the wind seems to hold its breath. On March 17, 2015, beneath the Giza Plateau, a team of 12 archaeologists stood in a circle around a set of monitors, watching green lines pulse across black screens. They'd been searching for 3 years, mapping, scanning, analysing every square metre of limestone bedrock beneath the most studied monument on Earth. The grant money was running out. The Egyptian authorities were losing patience. This was supposed to be their final week. Then, the radar technician saw something that made him stop breathing. The chamber appeared on the screen like a wound opening in the rock. Not small, not shallow. A cavity roughly 30 meters across, carved deep into bedrock that had supposedly been mapped completely decades ago. The depth reading alone made no sense. It sat more than 40 meters below the surface, in an area where natural cavities didn't form and ancient excavation would have been nearly impossible. The walls showed geometric precision, perfectly flat surfaces, right angles that nature doesn't create. For about 90 seconds, the team experienced what one member would later describe as pure archaeological euphoria. They'd found it, the hidden chamber. The one that legends whispered about but official records denied, 3 years of work vindicated in a single radar sweep. Then someone noticed the secondary readings. The electromagnetic field around the chamber wasn't behaving correctly. Equipment designed to measure rock density was picking up variations that suggested something other than empty space inside. Temperature readings fluctuated between sensors in ways that defied the surrounding geology. And there was something else. A rhythmic pattern in the data that one engineer described as almost biological. A pulse. Faint but consistent. The radar technician's face went pale. He ran the scan again. Same results. He adjusted the parameters, thinking equipment malfunction. The chamber remained. The anomalous readings persisted. He looked at the expedition leader and said something in French that the Egyptian workers didn't understand but recognized from his tone. Something was wrong. What happened next depends on who you ask. The official expedition log, released months later, mentions discovering a previously unknown cavity that required structural assessment before further investigation. It uses words like geological instability and preservation concerns. It suggests the team made a careful, measured decision to postpone exploration until proper safety protocols could be established. The leaked emails tell a different story. By 4 in the morning, satellite phones were burning. Calls to Cairo, calls to universities in Boston and Berlin, calls to offices that had nothing to do with archaeology. The excavation site, which had been open and accessible for 3 years, suddenly had armed guards posted at every entrance. Workers arriving for the morning shift found the area cordoned off. No explanation provided. Within 24 hours, concrete trucks arrived. Within 48 hours, the excavation shaft that had taken 3 months to dig was filled completely, sealed, made permanent. The radar equipment was packed and shipped back to Germany, where it would sit in storage for the next 2 years before anyone was allowed to examine it again. The 12 archaeologists signed non-disclosure agreements that included criminal penalties for violation. Most refused to discuss what they'd seen on those monitors. The few who spoke to colleagues in private mentioned things that made no sense, readings that couldn't be explained, patterns in the data that suggested the chamber wasn't just sitting there waiting to be discovered. It was doing something. Operating somehow. Active in ways that empty rooms carved from bedrock 3,000 years ago should never be. The official explanation satisfied no one who looked closely. Structural concerns didn't require armed guards. Preservation issues didn't demand NDAs with criminal teeth. Geological instability didn't explain why the Egyptian government moved faster to seal this chamber than they'd moved on any archaeological matter in decades. And no official report addressed the simplest, most disturbing question. Why would scientists who spent 3 years and millions of dollars searching for hidden chambers suddenly refuse to go near one they finally found? What could they have seen on those radar screens that transformed archaeological excitement into something closer to fear? The chamber sits there still, 40 meters below the Giza Plateau, filled with concrete that will take centuries to remove. Waiting beneath the desert like it's been waiting for thousands of years before that night in March, when 12 people learned that some discoveries are made specifically so they can be buried again. But this isn't the first time. In fact, There are 7 chambers across Egypt that remain sealed by choice, not circumstance. 7 locations where modern authorities maintain active restrictions, post guards, and provide explanations that crumble under basic scrutiny. 7 sites that archaeologists discuss in conference hallways but rarely mention in published papers, and each one has a story that makes people go quiet when you press for details. The Osiris Shaft lies beneath the Giza Causeway, discovered in 1999 at a depth that required industrial pumping equipment to reach. 3 levels descending into bedrock, the lowest containing a massive red granite sarcophagus surrounded by water that seeps back in no matter how many times they drain it. The walls carry pyramid text inscriptions about resurrection and the underworld, texts that were supposed to appear only in royal tombs, not in chambers that official chronology claims shouldn't exist at this location. When they opened the sarcophagus in 2000, 3 team members collapsed. 2 more fell ill within hours. Medical reports documented compounds in their blood that didn't match any known pathogen. The chamber flooded again naturally. It remains underwater now, accessible only by diving through passages so narrow that most people couldn't fit through them, even if authorities permitted access, which they don't. The Chamber of the Jade sits deep within the Serapeum of Saqqara, branching off from the main hall where giant granite boxes rest in darkness. Unlike the tourist sections, this particular tunnel was sealed in 1923, with industrial welding equipment brought to Egypt specifically for that purpose. Not stone blocks, not concrete. A steel door welded directly into the rock face, creating what amounts to a vault. Workers at the Serapeum still hear sounds from behind that door. A rhythmic thrumming that occurs at irregular intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes multiple nights in a row. Equipment occasionally picks up the frequency. No natural geological process produces that pattern. The French archaeologist who discovered the chamber died 3 days after entering it, bleeding from places that human bodies shouldn't bleed from. The door has remained welded shut for over a century. Beneath the Sphinx's right paw, ground-penetrating radar consistently shows a chamber that appears on no official map. The hidden hall, as workers call it, when they think no one's listening. Edgar Cayce described it in the 1,930 seconds before such scanning technology existed, which should make it easier to dismiss as fantasy, except that every modern scan confirms it's there. Access shafts exist. Someone carved them. Someone knew about this space, yet official site documentation makes no mention of it. When engineers proposed exploratory drilling in 2008, Egyptian authorities denied permission without stating a reason. The proposal wasn't rejected for funding issues or safety concerns. It simply received no response. The permits disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Guards patrol the area between the Sphinx's paws with instructions that have never been made public. Seti the Viz's tomb in the Valley of the Kings is one of the most beautiful in Egypt, decorated with detailed astronomical ceilings and painted corridors that tourists marvel at every season. What they don't see is the subterranean annex, a passage that extends far deeper than the official tour route ends. It descends at an angle that would put the lowest chambers well below the valley floor, far past where tomb architecture typically terminates. The passage was explored once in 1960. The team documented unusual acoustic properties and reported severe disorientation after spending more than 30 minutes below. They requested additional funding for proper exploration. Instead, authorities installed a locked door and removed that section from all tourist maps. The excavation report was classified and remains unavailable to researchers despite being over 60 years old. Behind Menkaura's pyramid sits a chamber workers call the Red Room, named not for decoration but for what happens to people who enter it. 3 separate incidents since 1980 involved workers experiencing severe nosebleeds and disorientation after spending time inside. One described a pressure sensation that built steadily the longer he remained. Another reported that his watch stopped functioning the moment he crossed the threshold and never worked again afterward. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities now pays workers double their standard rate to enter that space for maintenance checks. Most refuse anyway. It's not locked. It's not officially restricted. People simply won't go there. At Saqqara, the sealed horizon was discovered during renovation work in 2003. The excavation team documented it thoroughly, photographed the entrance, and measured the chamber's dimensions using remote equipment. Then authorities sealed it, not gradually, not after months of study. Within 72 hours of discovery, the entrance was bricked up and covered with material designed to match the surrounding wall so perfectly that visitors would never know it existed. No explanation was provided to the excavation team. Their documentation was collected and archived in a section of records that requires special permission to access. The Phantom Vault at Abydos exists in ancient texts but nowhere in modern archaeology. Temple inscriptions reference the Chamber of First Knowledge beneath the Osirion. Ritual texts describe priests entering it during specific astronomical alignments. Medieval Arab historians mention a sealed room that predated the visible temple structures, yet official site maps show nothing. When researchers petitioned for permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area in 2011, their request was denied on grounds that the site had been thoroughly surveyed already. The documents citing those previous surveys have never been made available for review. 7 chambers. 7 different locations spread across hundreds of kilometers. 7 official explanations that share a common characteristic. None of them explain why such extreme measures are necessary, why documentation disappears, or why authorities coordinate their silence so effectively across decades and regime changes. But here's the pattern that makes archaeologists uncomfortable. In every case, someone entered first. Someone saw what was inside before the restrictions began. And what they found changed official policy overnight, not gradually, through committees and review processes, immediately, as if the discovery itself demanded an instant response that overrode normal archaeological procedure. To understand why these chambers stay sealed today, we need to go back to 1922, the year King Tut's tomb was opened. The year one archaeologist learned that some doors are sealed from the inside for a reason. Howard Carter's public legacy rests on a single discovery. November 4th, 1922. The tomb of Tutankhamun, intact and glittering with gold, that had sat undisturbed for over 3,000 years. The photographs show a man in a suit and tie, calmly documenting artifacts, while the world celebrated the greatest archaeological find of the century. The official narrative describes meticulous excavation, careful preservation, and scientific triumph over the superstitions of ancient curses. Carter's private journals tell a different story entirely. These weren't meant for publication. Personal writings, letters to colleagues he trusted, observations recorded in notebooks that his estate kept sealed for decades after his death in 1939. When portions finally surfaced through academic networks in the 1,980 seconds, they revealed a man fundamentally changed by what he found in that tomb. Not changed by fame or treasure, but by something he encountered in the inner chambers that he spent the rest of his life trying to rationalize and ultimately failing to explain. The first 3 days proceeded exactly as the public record describes. Excitement, careful documentation, the systematic clearing of the antechamber. Carter's private notes from this period match his official logs almost word for word. Enthusiasm, professional satisfaction, archaeological precision. Then they breached the sealed doorway to the burial chamber itself. Carter's journal entry for November 29th, 1922, begins normally. Descriptions of the golden shrine, the condition of the seals, the presence of intact artifacts. Then, about halfway through the page, the handwriting changes, becomes tighter, more controlled, as if he's forcing himself to write carefully. He mentions finding inscriptions above the innermost doorway that he photographed but never published. Warnings, he called them, written in a script that predated the tomb by centuries. Not ritual threats, he wrote. Instructions, specific warnings about opening this particular seal during certain times. With astronomical calculations, I verified later. They were accurate. One of his team members, an Egyptian worker named Ahmed Hassan, refused to enter the burial chamber after the 3rd day. Carter's official expedition log records Hassan as having resigned for personal reasons. His private letter to a colleague at the British Museum tells a different version. Hassan claimed he heard voices coming from inside the sealed shrine, not echoes, not imagination. Voices speaking in a language he recognized but couldn't understand, coming from a space that was supposed to be silent and empty. Carter wrote that he dismissed Hassan's concerns at first, but admitted in the same letter that he'd heard something similar himself on the 2nd night. A resonance, he described it, like speech occurring at frequencies just outside human hearing range. The equipment recorded fluctuations. We couldn't. The illnesses began on the 6th day of working inside the burial chamber. 2 members of the expedition developed symptoms that British doctors in Cairo couldn't identify: high fever without infection, disorientation without head trauma, a sensation they described as being watched from inside their own minds. The symptoms faded after they left the tomb and didn't return unless they went back inside. Carter documented these cases in his journal but never mentioned them in official reports. Medical examination found nothing, he wrote. But something is affecting us. The longer we spend in the inner chamber, the stronger it becomes. He described areas of the tomb that violated basic thermodynamics. Sections of wall that registered warmer than their surroundings, despite no heat source, no sun exposure, no physical explanation. He took temperature readings with 3 different instruments, all showing the same impossible gradient. Cold corridors leading to warm chambers that shouldn't exist in subterranean spaces with no airflow. The wrong temperature, he called it, like the stone itself is generating heat, or something behind the stone is. But the detail that haunted Carter most appears in a letter written in 1934, 12 years after the discovery. He's writing to a French archaeologist who had asked about rumours of additional chambers. Carter's response is careful, measured, but admits more than his published work ever did. There was a 4th chamber, he wrote, behind the treasury, sealed with different materials than the other doors, older seals. When we opened it, the air that came out wasn't stale. It was wrong somehow. Chemical analysis found nothing unusual, but everyone who breathed it felt immediate unease. What was inside that space wasn't treasure, it was knowledge. Specific, technical knowledge about subjects we barely understand even now. Star charts showing planets we can't see without telescopes, anatomical diagrams that show understanding of genetics, mathematics that took us decades to redevelop. Carter sealed that 4th chamber again within hours of opening it, removed it from all official documentation, made his team swear silence, and spent the next 17 years of his life, according to his journals, questioning whether he'd made the right choice. "We preserve what we find," he wrote in 1936. But what if some things were meant to stay lost? What if the ancients sealed certain knowledge, not because they feared it being stolen, but because they feared it being known? His final journal entries, written in the months before his death, show a man wrestling with profound regret. Not regret over the discovery itself, but over the precedent it set. "We taught the world that sealed tombs should be opened," he wrote, "that ancient warnings are superstition, that nothing from the past can harm us. I know differently now. There are chambers in Egypt that should never be disturbed, not because of curses, because of what they contain, because of what they do to people who enter them, because of knowledge we're not ready to possess." He tried to warn others, quietly advised against several excavations in his later years, suggested that certain sealed chambers be left alone, studied remotely if at all. His warnings were dismissed as the paranoia of an aging man traumatized by years of public scrutiny and curse mythology. But Carter knew something that the archaeological community refused to acknowledge. He'd been inside. He'd seen what ancient Egyptians were capable of preserving. And he'd spent nearly 2 decades watching how that exposure changed him in ways he could never quite articulate but couldn't deny. His experience wasn't unique. Before him, there was Giovanni Belzoni in 1818, and after him, dozens more. But one expedition stands out: the 1928 Gedefra mission that entered a sealed chamber and emerged different. 6 years after Carter sealed his 4th chamber, a French archaeologist named Jean-Claude Moreau announced he'd found something extraordinary. North of Giza, in an area that most expeditions ignored because it had been surveyed repeatedly with no significant results, Moreau claimed to have discovered the entrance to Gedefra's hidden complex. Gedefra, the son who succeeded Khufu and whose pyramid sits unfinished and largely ignored by tourists. Moreau believed the real structure lay underground, concealed deliberately, preserved through methods that predated the more famous monuments. He assembled a team of 12, 6 French archaeologists, 5 Egyptian workers, and 1 British engineer, who specialized in underground excavation. They entered the chambers on March 14, 1928, equipped for a week-long exploration. They had food, water, lighting equipment, and communication protocols established with a surface team that maintained radio contact. Communication ceased after 48 hours. The surface team heard fragmented transmissions on the 2nd day. descriptions of corridors that extended far deeper than initial surveys suggested, mentions of architectural features that didn't match any known Egyptian construction. Then silence. Complete radio blackout that the surface team initially attributed to equipment failure or geological interference. They waited. Protocol required 72 hours before initiating emergency procedures. On the third night, at approximately 2 a.m., 8 members of the expedition emerged from the entrance shaft. Not together. One by one, over the course of 30 minutes, they climbed out separately, as if they'd gotten lost from each other in passages they'd been exploring as a group. The Egyptian workers who met them at the surface described men and women who looked decades older than they had 3 days earlier, disheveled, incoherent, eyes that wouldn't focus on anything directly. The first words anyone spoke clearly came from Moreau himself. Seal it now, tonight, before morning. 4 members of the expedition never came back, 2 French archaeologists, 1 Egyptian worker, and the British engineer. The 8 survivors couldn't or wouldn't explain what happened to them. When pressed by authorities, they provided contradictory accounts. Some claimed the 4 had gotten separated in the deeper passages. Others insisted they'd all been together when they decided to leave. One survivor later told a journalist, off the record, that the 4 had chosen to stay. That phrasing, exactly. Chosen to stay. In a sealed underground chamber with limited supplies and no clear reason to remain. Within 2 weeks, Moreau suffered a complete mental breakdown. French medical records describe acute psychosis with unusual features. He insisted he could still hear sounds from the chamber, despite being hundreds of kilometers away in a Cairo hospital. Drew elaborate geometric patterns on any surface available, patterns that mathematicians who later examined them noted bore similarities to non-Euclidean geometry. He was institutionalized in France and died there in 1931, never recovering coherent speech. 2 other survivors died within the year. Jacques Beaumont fell from his 4th-floor apartment balcony in Paris in September 1928. The windows were closed when neighbors found him on the street below. Official ruling: suicide. Marie Duchamp drowned in her bathtub in January 1929. She was found fully clothed. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. Official ruling: accidental death. The remaining 5 survivors scattered across Europe and North Africa. They refused contact with each other, refused interviews, refused to participate in any discussion of the expedition. But fragments of their testimony leaked out over the years through family members, medical records, and deathbed confessions. They described air that wasn't air in the deeper chambers. Breathing felt normal, but something about the atmosphere affected perception, made time feel elastic, made distances impossible to judge accurately. They mentioned rooms arranged in geometries that hurt to look at, corridors that seemed to curve in directions that eyes couldn't properly follow, inscriptions carved into walls that warned against opening the mouth of the horizon, a phrase that appears nowhere else in Egyptian texts, but that all 5 survivors remembered identically. The Egyptian government moved faster than it had on any archaeological matter in recent memory. Within 30 days of the survivors' emergence, the entrance shaft was sealed with concrete and stone. Permanent guards were posted. Official documentation declared the site structurally unsound, at risk of collapse, dangerous to human life. That explanation has held for 95 years. The site remains sealed. The guards remain posted. And no subsequent expedition has ever been granted permission to investigate what Moreau's team found in those chambers, or why 4 people chose to stay there in the darkness, rather than return to the surface with their colleagues. The pattern repeats: discovery, entry, terror, suppression, and a lifetime of silence for those who saw what was inside. But here's what makes the sealed chambers even more disturbing. It's not ancient curses keeping people out. It's modern science. Because when we finally developed technology advanced enough to see inside without entering, what we found was so impossible that it raised more questions than answers. The Osiris Shaft sits beneath the Giza Causeway, discovered in 1999 by a team using ground-penetrating radar to map the subterranean spaces around the pyramids. What they found shouldn't have existed according to official site chronology. 3 levels carved into bedrock, descending 100 feet below the surface, the lowest level containing a massive red granite sarcophagus, surrounded by water that seeped in from underground sources. The walls carried pyramid text inscriptions, religious formulas about resurrection and the journey through the underworld. Texts that were supposed to appear only in royal tombs, not in chambers that weren't supposed to be there at all. The discovery generated immediate excitement in archaeological circles. Here was proof of construction that predated the accepted chronology, evidence of architectural sophistication that official narratives had long downplayed. The sarcophagus itself became the focus of intense interest. Who or what had been buried in a chamber 100 feet underground, surrounded by religious texts suggesting importance equal to pharaohs? Getting permission to open it took months of negotiation with Egyptian authorities. When approval finally came in early 2000, the team began the painstaking process of pumping out the water. Industrial equipment ran for 6 weeks, slowly lowering the water level inch by inch, revealing more of the sarcophagus and its intricate carvings. The chamber's precision became more apparent as the water receded. Perfect right angles, walls carved so smoothly that modern tools would struggle to replicate the finish. And the sarcophagus itself, weighing an estimated 20 tons, positioned with such exactness that its placement alone suggested engineering knowledge beyond simple manual labor. They set a date for opening the sarcophagus: June 15th, 2000. 12 people present, including archaeologists, Egyptian officials, and a medical examiner who was there to analyze any remains found inside. The chamber had been pumped completely dry by this point. Lighting equipment illuminated the space. Cameras documented every angle. This was supposed to be a moment of archaeological triumph, carefully controlled and professionally executed. The lid moved at 10:47 a.m. It took 4 people using mechanical leverage to shift the granite cover enough to see inside. The moment the seal broke, 3 team members collapsed, not gradually, simultaneously, as if something had struck them all at once. 2 more began vomiting within seconds. Emergency protocols activated immediately. The collapsed team members were carried to the surface. The chamber was evacuated. Medical examination at a Cairo hospital found elevated levels of mercury in the blood of all 5 affected individuals. Not unusual for ancient tombs where mercury was sometimes used in burial practices. But the levels were inconsistent with simple environmental exposure. And there was something else, something the medical team couldn't identify. A biological agent present in blood samples that didn't match any known pathogen in their database. Complex protein structures that resembled viral material, but didn't behave like any virus on record. Too organized to be simple contamination. Too anomalous to be explained by known biological processes. 3 of the 5 recovered within days. 2 developed persistent symptoms. Chronic fatigue that prevented them from working. Cognitive issues that affected memory and spatial reasoning. 1 reported experiencing vivid dreams about the chamber, dreams that continued for months, always showing the same images: the sarcophagus open, something inside that wasn't a body, patterns of light that moved with mathematical precision. Egyptian authorities halted the project immediately. No further exploration, no additional analysis. The pumps were shut down and removed. The chamber was allowed to flood naturally, water seeping back in over the course of weeks until the sarcophagus disappeared beneath the surface again, just as it had been found. The site received new security measures, access restrictions that remain in force today. The chamber can only be reached by diving through narrow passages filled with water, a journey that requires specialized equipment and official permission that's never granted. But here's what official reports don't mention. The expedition photographer's images from inside the chamber, taken in the hours before the sarcophagus was opened, show distortions around the granite box. Visual aberrations that shouldn't appear with professional camera equipment in stable lighting conditions. Bands of interference that resembled electromagnetic distortion curving around the sarcophagus in patterns that suggested a field of some kind. Multiple cameras captured the same anomalies. Technical analysis couldn't explain them as equipment malfunction. And the electromagnetic readings taken during the final pumping phase showed something that made no physical sense: spikes in the local field strength that occurred in rhythmic patterns. Every 47 seconds, instruments detected a surge that lasted approximately 3 seconds, then faded. The pattern repeated consistently for the entire time the chamber was dry. When the lid was moved, the readings spiked dramatically, then ceased entirely, as if whatever was generating the field had stopped functioning the moment the seal broke. The water hides it now. The sarcophagus sits in darkness, 100 feet below the desert, surrounded by inscriptions about resurrection and transformation, generating readings that authorities insist are geological anomalies, but that no geologist can adequately explain. The chamber killed through something measurable, something that shows up in blood tests and medical scans, something ancient Egyptians knew how to create or contain. But the Osiris Shaft was flooded. The next chamber we need to discuss was completely dry, and that made what happened there even harder to explain. The Serapeum of Saqqara is one of Egypt's strangest sights, a vast underground complex carved into bedrock, containing 24 granite boxes that weigh up to 70 tons each. Official archaeology calls them burial containers for sacred bulls, part of the Apis cult that worshipped bovine deities. But the precision of the boxes, the impossibility of moving them through tunnels barely wide enough to accommodate their dimensions, and the complete absence of any mummified remains raises questions that most tour guides prefer not to address. The main hall is accessible to tourists during certain seasons. What tourists don't see is the Chamber of the Djed, a side tunnel that branches off from the primary corridor, sealed since 1,923 inches, a way that suggests something far more serious than historical preservation. French archaeologists discovered the chamber during expansion surveys of the Serapeum complex. Initial exploration revealed a space, unlike the main galleries, smaller, more precisely carved. The walls showed a level of finish that made even the impressive main hall look crude by comparison. No tool marks visible, surfaces that reflected light like polished glass. And in the center of the chamber, standing alone in perfect geometric isolation, a massive D-jade pillar carved from a single piece of meteoric iron. The D-jade pillar appears throughout Egyptian iconography, usually shown as a stylized spine or column representing stability and endurance. Pharaohs raised D-jade pillars during festivals. Priests incorporated them into resurrection rituals. The symbol appears on temple walls, in tomb paintings, on amulets worn by both living and dead, but those were symbolic representations, stone carvings, painted images. What the French team found in 1923 was something different. An actual D-jade pillar, full scale, carved from iron that spectroscopic analysis later confirmed, came from a meteorite, shaped into the precise proportions that hieroglyphic convention dictated. And it was vibrating. Not visibly. The human eye detected no movement, but equipment registered measurable oscillation. A frequency in the extremely low range, below what human hearing can consciously perceive, but well within the range that affects human physiology. The team measured it repeatedly, thinking instrument error. Every measurement confirmed the same result. The pillar was producing a rhythmic pulse at approximately 19 Hz, a frequency that modern research has since identified as capable of affecting vision, inducing anxiety, and in prolonged exposure, causing physical discomfort. Team members reported severe headaches within minutes of entering the chamber, nosebleeds that began spontaneously and proved difficult to stop. A sensation several of them described identically: pressure in places that don't have nerves, internal discomfort that wasn't quite pain but felt fundamentally wrong, as if their bodies were responding to something their conscious minds couldn't identify. The decision to seal the chamber came after one researcher, a young archaeologist named Philippe Laurent, touched the pillar directly. He collapsed instantly. When he regained consciousness hours later, he couldn't stop bleeding. Blood seeped from his nose and ears continuously despite medical intervention. Doctors in Cairo couldn't explain the mechanism. His blood showed no clotting deficiencies, no injuries that would account for the hemorrhaging. Yet it continued, progressively worsening, until he died 3 days later from cerebral hemorrhage caused by blood loss from vessels that shouldn't have been bleeding at all. The French Archaeological Authority made an extraordinary decision. Rather than simply bricking up the entrance as standard preservation protocol suggested, they brought industrial welding equipment to Egypt. Not a common tool at archaeological sites in 1923. Specialized equipment that required trained operators and specific materials. They installed a steel door at the chamber entrance and welded it directly into the surrounding stone, creating a seal that would require cutting torches to breach. Making it clear that this wasn't temporary protection. This was permanent containment. The welded door remains in place today, 99 years later. Egyptian authorities have never authorized its removal. Even discussions of exploring the chamber are quietly discouraged. Workers at the Serapeum, the ones who maintain the site and guard it during off hours, speak carefully about what they hear. Late at night, when tourists are gone and the underground complex sits in darkness, sounds come from behind that welded door, a rhythmic thrumming, barely audible to human ears, but unmistakable once you notice it. Equipment positioned near the door occasionally picks up the same frequency the French team measured in 1923, 19 Hz, regular as a heartbeat, constant as a machine. The ancient Egyptians revered the Dajjade pillar as a symbol of stability and power. Modern physics has discovered that certain crystal and metal structures can generate electromagnetic fields when subjected to pressure or vibration. The pillar in that sealed chamber is carved from meteoric iron, a material with magnetic properties that terrestrial iron doesn't naturally possess. Its shape follows precise mathematical proportions that appear throughout Egyptian sacred geometry. Was this chamber a power source? A weapon? Something else entirely that ancient Egyptians understood, but we've forgotten how to recognize? The welded door offers no answers. Just the perpetual pulse of something that's been vibrating in darkness for over 3,000 years, waiting behind steel that no authority will cut through. Water killed in the Osiris Shaft. Metal killed in the Serapeum. But there's a third chamber where the danger isn't physical at all. It's psychological. And psychological casualties are harder to dismiss because they leave survivors who can tell their stories, even when they wish they couldn't remember. Most people outside the archaeological community don't know that psychological screening protocols exist specifically for work in certain Egyptian sites. Not standard procedure for all excavations. Not general mental health support for the stress of fieldwork. Specific evaluation requirements established for sealed chambers that have demonstrated patterns of what internal documents carefully term cognitive disruption events. The protocols began appearing in the 1960 seconds, quietly implemented by several universities and government archaeological programs. Before entering designated sites, researchers undergo baseline psychological evaluation, memory tests, cognitive function assessments, personality inventories, then again after exiting, comparing before and after, watching for changes that standard fieldwork doesn't produce. The reason these protocols exist is simple. People change after entering certain chambers. Not everyone, not predictably, but consistently enough that institutions decided monitoring was necessary. Experienced archaeologists emerge with persistent psychological effects that don't fade with time or therapy. Inability to sleep in complete darkness. Obsessive drawing of symbols they encountered underground, repeating the patterns compulsively for months. Dissociative episodes where they lose awareness of their surroundings for minutes at a time. And in several documented cases, complete personality changes that friends and family insist represent fundamental alterations in who the person was before entry. Dr. Margaret Holbrook's case in 1973 remains the most thoroughly documented example. Cambridge-trained Egyptologist, specializing in Middle Kingdom religious texts, brought to Egypt to document a newly discovered annex beneath the temple of Seti I. She entered the sealed chamber on October 12 at 2:15 p.m., accompanied by 2 Egyptian workers who remained in the outer room while she proceeded alone to photograph and catalogue the inner space. 3 hours later, she emerged speaking fluent Middle Egyptian, not reading hieroglyphs aloud, not reciting memorized phrases from academic study, speaking as a native language, with correct pronunciation that scholars can only theorize about from written records, using colloquialisms and grammatical structures that wouldn't appear in formal texts, the kind of linguistic nuance that only comes from actual conversational fluency. She maintained this linguistic shift for 6 months before gradually reverting to English, the transition happening so slowly that she experienced periods of bilingual confusion where neither language felt entirely natural. During those 6 months, neurological examinations showed unusual activity patterns in her brain, heightened activity in language centers, but also in regions associated with memory retrieval. Yet Holbrook consciously experienced the Egyptian language as present knowledge, not recovered memory. She could hold conversations in Middle Egyptian, debate grammatical fine points, explain idioms that academic study of dead languages doesn't typically recover, all while having no conscious memory of learning any of it. More disturbing were the drawings she produced during this period. Detailed architectural plans for Egyptian sites she'd never visited, underground chambers that didn't appear in any published documentation. She drew them compulsively, filling notebooks with precise measurements and spatial relationships. When expeditions later explored several of these locations using her drawings as guides, they found sealed chambers exactly where she'd indicated. Chambers that matched her architectural specifications. Spaces that she'd somehow known about, despite never being there physically. Brain scans couldn't explain the mechanism. Neurologists found nothing structurally wrong. The language centers functioned normally, just processing information they shouldn't possess. One researcher suggested exposure to infrasound frequencies that certain chamber geometries might amplify, frequencies known to affect brain function and potentially trigger unusual neural activity. Another theory proposed unknown chemical compounds in the sealed atmosphere, substances that could cross the blood-brain barrier and temporarily alter neurological processing. But Holbrook herself, after recovering and spending years analyzing her experience, developed a different explanation. "These chambers aren't libraries," she told colleagues, who still trusted her enough to listen. "They're recordings. Ancient Egyptians encoded information into physical space itself, stone, geometry, maybe electromagnetic fields generated by specific mineral compositions. Information that prepared consciousness can access directly. We've lost the preparation techniques, so modern people experience it as contamination rather than knowledge transfer. Today, archaeological permits for certain sites require emergency psychological extraction protocols, on-site mental health professionals, procedures for removing researchers who show signs of cognitive disruption, requirements that exist nowhere else in field archaeology, requirements that officially exist for worker safety, but unofficially acknowledge something that most researchers won't discuss in published papers. Physical death, physiological contamination, psychological transformation. 3 different types of hazard in 3 different chambers. But there's a pattern in the ancient inscriptions themselves. Warnings carved thousands of years ago, almost as if ancient Egyptians knew exactly what they were protecting people from, or protecting from people. There's a secret among Egyptologists that rarely gets discussed outside conference rooms and private correspondence. Certain inscriptions around sealed chambers remain officially untranslated despite hieroglyphic writing being thoroughly understood for nearly 2 centuries. Not because the language is unclear, not because the grammar presents unusual challenges. The texts are perfectly readable to anyone with graduate-level training in Middle Kingdom Egyptian. They're left unpublished because of what they say. The Abydos sealed vault inscriptions provide the clearest example. Discovered in 1912 during expansion work at the temple complex, photographed extensively by the excavation team, and then carefully excluded from all official site documentation. For decades, these photographs existed only in private collections, passed between researchers who knew what they showed but understood why they couldn't be published openly. When copies finally surfaced through a deceased Egyptologist's estate in 2008, they revealed warnings written in perfectly standard Middle Kingdom script. No ambiguity. No metaphorical language requiring interpretation. Direct statements about what would happen if someone opened the sealed chamber below. Opening the mouth of the earth gives breath to what sleeps without breathing. That phrase appears 3 times in the inscription, each repetition accompanied by increasingly specific consequences. The text describes physical symptoms in medical detail: hemorrhaging from vessels in the brain, respiratory distress despite adequate oxygen, progressive neurological deterioration beginning within hours of exposure. Not poetic threats of divine retribution. Clinical descriptions of physiological processes, written by people who understood human anatomy well enough to predict exactly how the body would fail. Academic consensus has classified these inscriptions as ritual threats. The official position maintains they're meant to frighten grave robbers. Exaggerated warnings designed to protect sacred spaces through psychological intimidation. This classification allows Egyptologists to acknowledge the inscriptions exist without addressing what they actually say. Because what they actually say suggests ancient Egyptians were warning about something real, something they'd observed, something that killed predictably enough to describe the mechanism in advance. The hidden hall beneath the Sphinx has its own inscriptions. Not visible in the current excavations because authorities haven't officially acknowledged the chamber exists, despite ground-penetrating radar confirming its presence. But historical accounts from early excavations, before modern restrictions were established, describe warnings carved above the entrance, texts that specify symptoms associated with entering when the stars are wrong. The descriptions match documented experiences of explorers who violated sealed chambers: disorientation, temporal confusion, the sensation of multiple awareness streams occurring simultaneously. One inscription even provides a timeline, stating symptoms begin within the first hour of exposure and become irreversible after 6 hours inside. These aren't vague curses. They're usage instructions for hazardous spaces, the equivalent of modern warning labels, written by people who knew exactly what would happen because they'd observed it happen. At Giza, the chamber of the descending corridor contains inscriptions that most tour guides skip past quickly. The visible texts are standard religious formulas, prayers for the deceased, appeals to various deities. But deeper in the corridor, past where tourists are allowed, warnings cover the walls in dense script. Warnings about disturbing the sleepers who wait for the sky to return, about maintaining seals until the stars complete their great cycle, about consequences that affect not just individuals who enter, but entire lineages of their descendants. What makes these warnings particularly unsettling is the astronomical mathematics incorporated into them, precise calculations specifying when chambers could be safely entered based on celestial alignments. Modern astronomical software has verified these calculations. They're accurate for phenomena that occur on cycles of thousands of years, precession of the equinoxes, orbital variations that affect Earth's axial tilt, patterns that require sustained observation over timeframes longer than any single civilization typically maintains continuous records. Ancient Egyptians didn't guess at these numbers, they calculated them, which means they either inherited the knowledge from earlier cultures with even longer observation periods, or they maintained astronomical records far more extensive than surviving papyri suggest. Either possibility indicates technical sophistication that official chronologies struggle to accommodate. The mathematical precision suggests these warnings aren't supernatural. They're practical safety information based on understanding we've lost. Perhaps about geological activity that follows astronomical cycles. Perhaps about electromagnetic field variations that correlate with planetary positions. Perhaps about other natural phenomena that ancient Egyptians measured and modern science hasn't yet recognized as relevant to sealed underground structures. Several chambers have inscriptions warning they should never be opened until the return. No specification of what is meant to return. No timeline provided, just the instruction to wait. These texts appear in chambers separated by hundreds of kilometers, carved in different time periods, yet using nearly identical phrasing. As if the instruction was so important that it persisted across dynasties and locations. As if ancient Egyptians were leaving messages for a future they knew would come, but couldn't predict precisely. One inscription at Saqqara, documented before the site received modern restrictions, contained what appeared to be a knowledge test. Questions about astronomy, mathematics, and engineering principles. As if the text was designed to screen readers. As if ancient Egyptians expected that whoever eventually opened the chamber would need to demonstrate specific technical understanding before proceeding. The questions weren't simple. They required knowledge of orbital mechanics, structural engineering under pressure, and properties of materials under extreme conditions. Knowledge that ancient Egypt supposedly didn't possess, yet the inscription treats as prerequisite for safe entry. These texts exist. Egyptologists can read them. But academic papers don't translate them, because doing so would require acknowledging what they imply. That ancient Egyptians knew these chambers were dangerous in specific, measurable ways. That they understood enough about the hazards to describe symptoms, provide timelines, and specify conditions for safe entry. That they were leaving instructions for people who would come thousands of years later, with technology advanced enough to open sealed spaces, but possibly not advanced enough to survive what was inside. The warnings weren't just carved into stone. Some of them included rituals, detailed procedures that ancient priests performed before entering sealed spaces safely. In the 1,930 seconds, one archaeologist tried to follow those rituals exactly. What happened next became classified for 70 years. Dr. Hans Bergmann had a theory that made his colleagues uncomfortable. A German Egyptologist working in the Valley of the Kings during the mid-1930 seconds, he believed that ancient Egyptian rituals weren't religious superstition, but practical safety procedures based on scientific principles that civilization had forgotten. Where other researchers saw symbolic gestures and spiritual theatre, Bergmann saw engineering protocols disguised in ceremonial language. In 1936, working on a survey project near the tomb of Amenhotep III, he discovered a chamber that would test his theory in ways he hadn't anticipated. The entrance sat behind a rock face that natural erosion had concealed for centuries. Inside, the seals remained intact. And carved into the antechamber walls, in hieroglyphic script of unusual clarity, were detailed instructions for entering the inner space safely. Not warnings, not threats. Instructions. Step-by-step procedures with the kind of specificity that technical manuals provide. The text specified timing based on solar alignment, occurring only 3 times per year when the sun's angle through a precisely positioned shaft illuminated specific markers on the chamber floor. It described compounds to be burned, listing ingredients with such botanical precision that Bergmann spent 4 months sourcing them from across Egypt and Europe. It detailed the arrangement of copper and iron objects in geometric patterns around the chamber entrance, providing exact measurements and angles that had to be verified multiple times before entry. Where other archaeologists would have dismissed these instructions as ritual theatre, Bergmann decided to follow them exactly. He documented his reasoning in detailed journal entries. If these were truly safety procedures, following them might allow safe exploration of a chamber that would otherwise prove hazardous. If they were merely ceremonial, following them would demonstrate their irrelevance without compromising the excavation. Either outcome provided valuable information. The preparation took 7 months. Waiting for the correct solar alignment meant postponing the expedition through 2 cycles when other commitments prevented the team from being ready. The compound preparation required careful attention to proportions and processing methods that ancient texts specified but didn't explain. The metal arrangements had to be positioned with surveying precision, each piece placed according to angles that Bergmann verified using modern instruments, finding that the ancient specifications were geometrically exact. On the designated day, when the sun reached the specified angle and the shadows fell across the chamber floor exactly as the inscriptions predicted, Bergmann and 2 assistants entered the main chamber. They carried lighting equipment, documentation tools, and enough supplies for several hours of work inside a space that had been sealed for over 3,000 years. They spent 4 hours inside, documenting, photographing, cataloguing what they found. When they emerged as the sun set and the alignment window closed, all 3 were completely unharmed, no headaches, no nosebleeds, no psychological effects, no equipment malfunctions, no symptoms of the kind that had affected other expeditions in sealed chambers. The rituals had worked. Whatever hazards existed in that space, following the ancient procedures had protected them completely. What they found inside made the 7 months of preparation worthwhile. The chamber contained knowledge that Bergmann described in his journal as advanced beyond our current understanding. Star charts, showing planets not visible to the naked eye, positioned with accuracy that wouldn't be achieved by Western astronomy for decades. Medical procedures describing surgical techniques for conditions that modern medicine was only beginning to treat successfully. Metallurgical processes for creating alloys that European foundries were still trying to perfect. Mathematical formulas for calculating structural loads and material stresses that wouldn't appear in engineering textbooks until the mid-20th century. Bergmann documented everything methodically. Photographs, detailed sketches, translations of the technical texts carved into the walls. He was preparing a comprehensive publication that would revolutionize understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities and force academia to reconsider assumptions about technological progression in ancient civilizations. Then, in 1937, Nazi authorities seized his research, not requested it, not asked to review it. Seized it under state security provisions, classifying everything related to the expedition as important to national interests. Bergmann's photographs, journals, translations, and artifacts were removed from his office by officials who provided no explanation beyond stating the material was now under government control. The expedition findings disappeared into bureaucratic darkness. Bergmann himself died in 1944. Official records state natural causes, but the circumstances were suspicious enough that colleagues questioned the conclusion. He was 52, previously healthy, and died suddenly in his Berlin apartment during a period when many academics who possessed sensitive information met convenient ends. Only fragments of his work survived. A Swiss colleague who had corresponded with Bergmann throughout the expedition maintained copies of letters and preliminary notes that Bergmann had sent before the Nazi seizure. These fragments remained in private hands until 2006, when age-based declassification protocols finally made them accessible to researchers. They provide tantalizing glimpses of what the full documentation must have contained, but the core findings remain lost in archives that Germany insists don't exist or were destroyed during the war. Modern attempts to replicate Bergmann's approach have been consistently denied permission by Egyptian authorities, not rejected with specific justifications, simply denied. Applications for permits to conduct similar ritual-based explorations receive no response, disappearing into bureaucratic silence. The official position maintains that such approaches aren't scientifically valid, despite Bergmann's documented success demonstrating otherwise. The implications are uncomfortable for multiple reasons. If ancient rituals were actually decontamination or protective procedures based on legitimate scientific principles, it suggests Egyptian technical knowledge exceeded what current chronologies allow. And more disturbing, if the rituals worked, what exactly were they protecting against that required such elaborate safeguards? What exists in sealed chambers that can kill unprepared explorers, but can be safely approached with the right precautions? Bergmann's success raises an obvious question. If we could survive entering these chambers with proper preparation, why don't we? The answer came in the 1,990 seconds, when ground-penetrating radar and other technologies finally let us see inside sealed chambers without opening them. What they revealed was so impossible that it led to a complete change in excavation policy across Egypt. The official explanations for why chambers stay sealed follow predictable patterns. Sealed for preservation purposes. Structurally unstable and dangerous to human safety. Requires further study before exploration can proceed. Not historically significant enough to fund. Justify excavation costs. Language carefully chosen to sound reasonable, scientific, concerned with proper methodology and public safety. The ancient inscriptions say something entirely different. What sleeps here must not wake. The guardians do not rest. To open is to release what was sealed for cause. Not metaphorical warnings, not poetic flourishes. Direct statements about active containment. About things that remain dangerous despite millennia of isolation. The contrast becomes sharper when you examine specific cases. The chamber at Saqqara, officially described as structurally unstable, was surveyed by engineering teams in 2004 using ground-penetrating radar and stress analysis equipment. Their report, leaked years later, concluded the chamber was in perfect structural condition. The stone showed no stress fractures. The ceiling demonstrated no risk of collapse. The report recommended the site was safe for exploration with standard archaeological precautions. Egyptian authorities filed the report and continued using structural instability as justification for keeping the chamber sealed. Sites claimed to be fully documented often have extensive areas that remain officially unmapped. The subterranean annex of Seti I's tomb appears in survey reports from 1960, showing passages that extend far deeper than tourist maps indicate. Modern site documentation makes no mention of these deeper levels. When researchers request access to the 1960 survey data, they're informed the documents are unavailable for unspecified reasons. The chambers exist in archival records but not in current official descriptions. Locations dismissed as having no historical significance sometimes appear in ancient king lists as critically important. The Phantom Vault at Abydos is referenced in temple inscriptions as the Chamber of First Knowledge, a site where priests underwent initiation into the deepest mysteries of Egyptian religion. Medieval historians mention it as a location of great sanctity predating the visible temple structures. Yet modern archaeological authorities claim no such chamber exists, despite ground-penetrating radar suggesting otherwise. The pattern holds across every sealed site. When physical evidence contradicts official narratives, the evidence becomes restricted. Engineering reports that challenge structural instability claims get classified. Survey data showing unmapped chambers becomes unavailable to researchers. Ancient texts describing important sites get dismissed as mythological or misinterpreted. Internal communications tell a different story than public statements. Leaked emails from archaeological authorities contain frank discussions of sites we can't explain adequately and artifacts better left undiscovered until we understand the implications. The officials issue public statements describing identical locations as thoroughly understood and archaeologically mundane. The disconnect isn't accidental, it's policy. So here's the question that official explanations never address. If there's nothing dangerous or significant in these chambers, why the elaborate security measures? Why the career-ending non-disclosure agreements? Why the consistent pattern of dismissing ancient warnings that proved accurate in every documented case where they were ignored? The ancient inscriptions say, danger, containment, catastrophic consequences if opened improperly. The officials say preservation, structure, mundane archaeology. One source was written by people who built and sealed these chambers. The other by people who found them thousands of years later and decided they know better. Which source would you trust? Words are one thing. But in the 1,990 seconds, we developed technology that could show us what's actually inside these chambers without opening the doors. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, electromagnetic scanning, tools ancient Egyptians never imagined. What they revealed was supposed to settle the mysteries once and for all. Instead, it made everything impossibly more complicated. Muon tomography sounds like science fiction, but it's remarkably straightforward physics. Cosmic rays bombard Earth constantly, producing particles called muons that pass through matter at predictable rates. Dense material absorbs more muons. Empty space lets them through. By positioning detectors and measuring muon penetration patterns, you can map internal structures without drilling a single hole. X-ray vision for pyramids, essentially. Non-invasive, completely safe for ancient monuments. In 2015, an international team led by Japanese researchers positioned muon detectors inside and around the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Scan Pyramids project, officially sanctioned by Egyptian authorities, designed to finally answer questions about internal spaces that conventional methods couldn't reach. The pyramid had been measured, mapped, and explored for centuries, but muon tomography offered precision that previous techniques couldn't match. 2 years later, in November 2017, the team announced their findings in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, peer-reviewed, verified by multiple independent analysis teams, impossible to dismiss as speculation or misinterpretation. They'd found a void, a massive internal space approximately 100 feet long, located above the Grand Gallery, a chamber that shouldn't exist according to every architectural analysis of the pyramid, a space that no historical text mentioned and no previous exploration had detected. The archaeological community erupted with excitement. This was the most significant discovery in the Great Pyramid in over a century, possibly the most important find in Egyptology in decades. A completely unknown chamber in the most studied structure on Earth. Questions multiplied immediately. What was its purpose? How had it remained hidden? What might it contain? When would exploration begin? Then nothing happened. No follow-up expedition, no exploratory drilling, no camera insertions, no announcement of plans to access this void. The discovery was published, discussed in academic circles, featured in documentary programs, and then effectively shelved. Egyptian authorities made no moves toward investigation. The Scan Pyramids team, eager to continue their work, found their requests for further access delayed, then quietly denied. The official explanation centered on preservation concerns. Accessing the void might damage the pyramid's internal structure. Any drilling would compromise the monument's integrity. Better to leave it untouched than risk harm to a World Heritage Site. The reasoning sounds protective, cautious, archaeologically responsible. Except the void isn't a structural element. Muon data shows it's a deliberately constructed chamber, not a gap left by building techniques. The walls have uniform thickness. The space is precisely rectangular. This is architecture, not accident. And modern drilling techniques can create exploratory holes smaller than a pencil, using flexible cameras that cause negligible damage. Museums use these methods routinely for examining sealed artifacts. The technology exists, the expertise is available, the damage argument doesn't hold under scrutiny. More intriguing are the details that emerged from continued scanning. The void doesn't exist in isolation. Subsequent muon studies revealed it connects to a series of narrow passages descending toward an area beneath the pyramid that has never been excavated or officially mapped. Not just a single chamber, but part of a larger system. A network of spaces extending into regions where official site documentation claims nothing exists. Communication between the scanning teams and Egyptian antiquities authorities, portions of which leaked through academic networks, showed disagreement about how to proceed. Team members advocated for at least remote camera insertion, minimal invasive techniques that would answer basic questions about the void's contents without compromising anything. The technology was ready. The procedures were tested. They simply needed permission. Egyptian authorities refused. not with detailed justifications about specific preservation concerns, just refusal. The findings were complete as published, according to official statements. No further investigation was necessary or planned. The matter was considered resolved, despite answering none of the obvious questions that any newly discovered chamber would raise. This decision becomes more suspicious when you consider that modern scanning techniques could explore the void without physical damage to the pyramid. Remote-operated cameras, flexible fiber optics, ground-penetrating radar from multiple angles, all non-invasive methods that authorities surely know about. The technology argument fails, so do the preservation concerns. What remains is simply, we don't want to look inside. The electromagnetic readings from the void's vicinity add another layer of strangeness. Independent research teams, working with publicly available data, identified unexplained variations in the local electromagnetic field near the void's location. Patterns that don't match known geological sources. The variations show rhythmic characteristics. Not random fluctuations, but organized patterns that some researchers noted resemble manufactured signals rather than natural phenomena. Official responses to these observations have been dismissive. Geological anomalies, measurement artifacts, nothing worth investigating. Yet the patterns persist across multiple measurement sessions, using different equipment, and they correlate specifically with the void's location, stronger near the chamber and fading with distance. Theories about what's inside the void range widely. Some suggest treasure chambers, following the traditional assumption that hidden spaces in pyramids contain valuable artifacts. Others propose astronomical observation purposes, thinking the void might align with celestial phenomena. A few researchers quietly suggest something more disturbing, that ancient Egyptians wanted this space both preserved and inaccessible. That the void serves a function requiring isolation. That whatever is inside needs to stay sealed not because we might damage it, but because accessing it might be dangerous. 7 years have passed since the announcement. The void remains unexplored. Egyptian authorities provide no timeline for investigation and increasingly avoid discussing the discovery altogether. Questions about future plans receive polite deflection or no response at all. The most significant architectural discovery in the Great Pyramid in modern times sits in permanent limbo, officially acknowledged but practically ignored. The void is there. Multiple independent scans confirm it, published in Nature, verified by international teams. Undeniable, yet authorities have decided that knowing it exists is enough. Actually seeing inside isn't necessary. The discovery was made specifically so it could be documented and then forgotten. The Great Pyramid void is massive, architectural, and officially acknowledged. But there are other chambers that radar has revealed. Smaller spaces, deeper locations, far stranger geometries. Chambers that don't appear on any historical plans, but show up on every modern scan. Chambers that, according to the data, shouldn't be able to exist where they are. There's a peculiar problem facing Egyptian archaeology, one that doesn't get discussed in museum exhibitions or documentaries. It's not about what we've found. It's about what our instruments keep detecting in places where nothing should exist. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't lie. It sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and measures what bounces back. Dense materials like stone create one signature. Empty spaces create another. The technology is reliable enough that construction companies use it to map underground utilities before breaking ground. When archaeologists point these same instruments at ancient sites, they expect to find known chambers, maybe a few surprises. What they don't expect is to detect structures that violate every principle of ancient engineering and occasionally seem to violate physics itself. The Giza Plateau has been scanned more thoroughly than almost any archaeological site on Earth. Between 2003 and 2005, multiple teams conducted comprehensive ground-penetrating radar surveys beneath the pyramids and surrounding structures. The official reports mention a few minor discoveries, small chambers, previously unknown passages, the usual findings. What those reports don't mention are the deep returns. Signals bouncing back from chambers more than 400 feet beneath the surface, far deeper than any known excavation from the ancient period. That depth alone creates problems. Ancient workers would have needed sophisticated ventilation systems to breathe at that level. They would have needed technology to remove water, because 400 feet puts you well below the water table. Modern drilling at that depth encounters flooding almost immediately. Yet the scans show hollow spaces, large hollow spaces, and they're not flooded. The returns indicate empty chambers with precise geometric boundaries, not the irregular signatures you'd expect from natural cave formations. The geometry suggests artificial construction, rectangular spaces, straight corridors. But when these findings were presented to the Egyptian authorities overseeing excavations, permission to investigate was denied. The structures don't appear in any ancient text. They don't fit the timeline of known construction. Therefore, the official position states, they're probably scanning artifacts, false readings, created by geological formations that happen to look artificial. Except the same false readings keep appearing. In 2010, thermal imaging revealed something beneath the step pyramid at Saqqara that shouldn't be possible with scanning artifacts. A chamber arranged in what mathematicians immediately recognized as a Fibonacci spiral, the same mathematical sequence found in Nautilus shells, galaxy formations, Renaissance art. A pattern that emerges naturally in biological growth, but requires deliberate calculation to construct in architecture. The ancient Egyptians left no mathematical texts describing Fibonacci sequences. The concept wasn't formalized in the Western world until the 13th century. Yet beneath Saqqara, thermal sensors detected a chamber carved in that exact pattern, the curvature precise enough that multiple mathematical analyses confirmed it wasn't approximately spiral-shaped, but exactly conforming to the Fibonacci sequence at every measured point. Creating such a chamber would require removing stone in continuously curved patterns, at depths where ancient workers would have minimal light and limited air. The engineering challenge isn't just difficult for ancient technology, it's difficult for modern technology. You can't carve a Fibonacci spiral into bedrock using copper chisels. You need precision cutting equipment guided by mathematical calculations at every step. When engineers examined the thermal data, some admitted privately that they had no idea how such a structure could be created without modern surveying equipment and power tools. The public statement from authorities was more carefully worded. The thermal imaging had detected geological formations that coincidentally resembled mathematical patterns. Further investigation wasn't necessary. Then, Abydos produced something that forced a different kind of silence. Between 2012 and 2015, multiple scanning techniques were applied to the temple complex: ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic surveys, seismic imaging. Standard archaeological practice is to use multiple technologies to verify findings, since each method has its limitations. What happened at Abydos was unprecedented. Different scanning frequencies revealed different structures in the same physical location. Lower frequency radar showed a configuration of chambers arranged in one pattern. Higher frequency radar showed completely different chambers in exactly the same space. Same coordinates, same depth, different structures depending on what frequency you used to look. Engineers assumed equipment malfunction. They recalibrated. They brought in different instruments from different manufacturers. They ran the scans again. The results remained consistent. Multiple teams using different technologies all detected the same impossible situation chambers that appeared to occupy the same physical space simultaneously, visible or invisible, depending on the electromagnetic frequency used to detect them. Some physicists suggested the chambers might be arranged to exploit acoustic or electromagnetic properties, creating intentional artifacts in scanning equipment through geometric manipulation of signal propagation. But implementing such a design would require understanding wave mechanics and electromagnetic theory that wouldn't be developed for thousands of years after Abydos was constructed. The honest assessments exist in internal reports. One engineer wrote simply, "We're detecting real structures, we just don't understand what we're looking at." But honesty doesn't make it into press releases. What makes it into official statements are references to scanning errors, natural geological formations, or measurement anomalies. What never gets mentioned is that these specific anomalies repeat across different sites, different equipment, and different teams. The underground network beneath Giza, the spiral beneath Saqqara, the overlapping chambers at Abydos, all dismissed with variations of the same explanation. Our instruments are showing us things that aren't really there or aren't really what they appear to be. Every attempt to physically excavate to these detected chambers has been denied. Environmental concerns at one site, structural stability issues at another, simply not a priority at a third, despite the potentially revolutionary nature of what might be found. The denials have become more creative over time, but the result remains consistent. We now have detailed maps of underground structures based on data, too consistent and too precise to dismiss as instrument error. Maps of spaces that officially don't exist. Descriptions of engineering that officially isn't possible. And a growing collection of reasons why we're not allowed to confirm what our technology keeps telling us is down there. Ground-penetrating radar shows a chamber beneath Saqqara, arranged in a perfect Fibonacci spiral, a mathematical concept ancient Egyptians supposedly never knew. When 3 different teams got the same impossible result, authorities stopped allowing scans of the area. The data is classified, the location is restricted. The question remains, how did they build it? Voids we can't enter. Geometries that shouldn't exist. But here's what makes all of this darker. In some cases, we did send cameras into these spaces before authorities shut everything down. The footage exists. Some of it leaked. And what it shows is exactly why they don't want cameras going places they can't control. Rudolf Gantenbrink was a German robotics engineer hired in 1993 to improve ventilation in the Great Pyramid. He designed a small robot equipped with a camera and sent it up the Queen's Chamber's southern shaft, a narrow passage, barely 8 inches square that humans couldn't navigate. The robot climbed 200 feet before encountering a limestone door with copper handles. The footage aired on television worldwide. What happened next didn't. In a later expedition, Gantenbrink drilled through that door. His camera revealed another shaft continuing beyond, walls covered in markings that appear in no official documentation of the pyramid's interior. The footage was immediately confiscated. Gantenbrink's contract was terminated. The passage was sealed. When asked about the second expedition years later, Egyptian authorities stated it never occurred. But low-resolution copies of that footage circulated among researchers who insist the drilling happened and the symbols were real. The Osiris Shaft is officially documented a flooded chamber beneath the Giza Plateau with a massive granite sarcophagus on its 3rd level. The chamber was explored, documented, and sealed again in the early 2000s. What's not officially documented is footage from a waterproof camera probe sent deeper into the 3rd level's flooded sections before the site was closed. The leaked footage quality is poor, showing dark water and stone surfaces illuminated by the camera's lights. Then, for several seconds, the lights switch off to test underwater visibility. In that absolute darkness, geometric patterns on the submerged floor appear to emit light, not reflected light. The camera's lights are off. The patterns seem to pulse with a pale luminescence that has no identified source. Bioluminescence requires living organisms. Phosphorescence requires prior light exposure to charge the material. This sealed chamber had been in absolute darkness for thousands of years. The footage shows light with no apparent source. The footage was never mentioned in official reports of the Osiris Shaft exploration. Then there's the 2009 Saqqara incident. A local Egyptian team, working after hours without official permission, inserted a fiber optic camera into a newly discovered passage. Their footage shows a small chamber with completely smooth walls. Not carved smooth, but showing no tool marks whatsoever, as if the stone had been formed rather than excavated. In the center of the chamber sits what they described as a perfect crystal sphere, approximately 1 meter in diameter. The footage captures their shocked reactions in Arabic, then it cuts off abruptly. The team was arrested that night. Their equipment was confiscated. The location was sealed with concrete within 24 hours. Criminal charges were filed for unauthorized archaeological exploration. Years later, a family member leaked portions of the footage online. It's been removed from major platforms repeatedly, though copies continue to resurface. These leaks are dismissed as hoaxes, misidentifications, doctored footage. Analysis suggesting authenticity is countered with analysis suggesting manipulation. But what reveals more than the footage itself is the response. Immediate confiscation, criminal charges, systematic removal from every platform. This level of reaction to what officials claim are hoaxes suggests the content is real and revealing something that must remain suppressed. In 2009, a local Egyptian team put a camera where they shouldn't have. The footage shows something in a sealed chamber that shouldn't exist. They were arrested within 24 hours. The footage was ordered destroyed, but a low-resolution copy survived. Once you see it, you understand why they didn't want anyone else to. So modern technology shows us chambers we're not allowed to explore, containing things we're not supposed to see. But here's what connects everything we've discussed so far: the Vatican. Because since 1929, the Catholic Church has maintained a permanent presence in Egyptian archaeological missions, with veto power over certain discoveries. And the documents that explain why finally leaked in 2016. Most people know 1929 as the year of the Wall Street crash. For the Vatican, it was the year the Lateran Treaty restored their status as an independent state after decades of political irrelevance following the loss of the Papal States. What far fewer people know is that in the same year, the Vatican negotiated a separate agreement with Egypt, one that had nothing to do with diplomatic recognition and everything to do with what lay beneath the desert sand. The treaty isn't secret in the technical sense. It exists in archives. But it's never discussed in official histories of Egyptian archaeology, and both parties become remarkably evasive when asked about its provisions. Portions of the document were leaked by Italian journalists in 2016, and what they reveal is a level of control that makes no sense unless both parties knew something they weren't sharing with the public. The agreement grants Catholic representatives the right to preview major archaeological discoveries before public announcement. That alone is unusual. Why would Egypt, a Muslim country, give a Christian institution first look at its pagan ancient history? But the treaty goes further. It provides Vatican representatives with authority to classify certain findings as theologically sensitive, effectively halting further investigation until the Church determines otherwise. In practice, this meant embedding a Vatican archaeologist in major excavations, with power to stop work if discoveries conflicted with Church doctrine or revealed information the Vatican deemed dangerous. The official justification was preservation of Christian holy sites and artifacts. Egypt contains significant early Christian history monasteries, Coptic churches, locations associated with the Holy Family's flight into Egypt. Protecting these sites makes diplomatic sense. But the treaty's actual language extends far beyond Christian-era locations. It specifically mentions chambers of pre-dynastic origin and grants the Vatican right of first access to anything predating established Egyptian chronology. This single phrase reveals something extraordinary. In 1929, both parties acknowledged the existence of structures beneath Egypt older than official history admitted. They were making provisions to control how information about those structures would be released. The power was exercised repeatedly over the following decades. In 1952, excavation of a chamber near Giza was halted when Vatican representatives determined it contained astronomical calculations predating biblical creation timelines by thousands of years. The chamber was sealed, its location classified, and the excavation team disbanded. In 1967, an entire section of tombs at Luxor containing creation myths that contradicted Genesis was classified as theologically sensitive. The tombs remain technically open, but are never included on tourist circuits, and researchers requesting access face bureaucratic obstacles that effectively amount to denial. In 1983, artifacts depicting Egyptian gods performing miracles identical to those attributed to Jesus in the New Testament were quietly removed from Egypt entirely, transported to Vatican storage facilities where they remain unavailable for independent study. Why would Egypt agree to this arrangement? The answers involve complex political exchanges that benefited both parties. The Vatican provided Egypt with support in international forums during periods of diplomatic isolation. The Church funded restoration projects at significant sites, bringing tourist revenue and global attention. But the deeper reason involves shared interest in maintaining certain historical narratives. Egypt's identity as the cradle of one of humanity's first great civilizations depends on a specific timeline and narrative of development. The Vatican's authority rests on biblical history being literally true, or at least metaphorically accurate. Both institutions had reasons to suppress evidence of civilizations predating accepted chronologies, or possessing knowledge that shouldn't have existed when history says they existed. The most telling aspect of the 1929 agreement is what it implies about the depth of knowledge both parties possessed. Treaties aren't negotiated around hypothetical concerns. If the Vatican and Egypt agreed to protocols for handling predynastic discoveries in 1929, they must have already known such discoveries were likely, perhaps even inevitable given ongoing and planned excavations. They were establishing control mechanisms before something was found that would raise questions neither institution wanted to answer. The agreement technically remains in force, though both parties deny Vatican veto power exists. When journalists questioned Egyptian officials about the leaked documents in 2016, the response was carefully worded. The Vatican maintains consultative relationships with Egyptian archaeology, serving as valued partners in preservation efforts. When pressed about whether Vatican representatives can halt excavations, officials insist all decisions rest with Egyptian authorities. The leaked documents tell a different story, showing correspondence where Vatican representatives explicitly denied permission to proceed with specific excavations, and Egyptian authorities complied without question. In 1929, Egypt and the Vatican signed a secret agreement giving the Catholic Church veto power over Egyptian archaeological discoveries. The document specifically mentions pre-dynastic chambers and theological contradictions. Why would a Muslim country give a Christian church control over its ancient pagan history? The 1929 agreement explains the Vatican's presence, but it doesn't explain their specific interest in sealed chambers. For that, we need to look at the Vatican's secret archives, particularly the section they don't admit exists, but that leaked documents prove contains detailed information about Egyptian sealed chambers collected over centuries. The Vatican secret archives were recently rebranded as the Apostolic Archives, in what many saw as an attempt to shed the sinister connotations of secret. The name changed, the contents didn't. And among those contents, leaked inventory lists confirm the existence of a section devoted entirely to what Vatican catalogers call pre-Abrahamic structures, essentially a comprehensive catalogue of ancient sites worldwide that predate biblical timelines or contain information that contradicts church doctrine. The Egyptian section is particularly extensive. It's been compiled over centuries from reports submitted by Christian travelers, medieval pilgrims, Crusader-era knights, Renaissance explorers, and modern archaeologists with church connections. The leaked inventory lists from 2016 show the Vatican possesses detailed documentation of sealed Egyptian chambers, including precise locations, architectural details, inscription translations, and in some cases, artifacts that were secretly removed from Egypt over the centuries and never returned. Maps drawn in the 1500s show chambers beneath temples that wouldn't be officially discovered until the 20th century. Translation texts from the 1700s describe inscriptions that mainstream archaeology hasn't been allowed to access even today. Most significantly, the archives contain first-person accounts from people who entered sealed chambers before modern restrictions existed, before anyone understood there was something unusual about these spaces that might require caution. Medieval reports describe rooms of demons and halls where the old gods sleep beneath Egyptian temples. These accounts span different centuries and come from authors who couldn't possibly have coordinated their stories. Yet they describe remarkably consistent phenomena: disorientation, visions, temporal confusion, encounters with presences that medieval Christians interpreted as demons, but described in ways that precisely match modern accounts of psychological effects experienced in sealed chambers. A Franciscan monk entered a chamber beneath Karnak Temple in the 1400s. His report, preserved in Vatican archives, describes how he emerged, claiming he had witnessed the moment of creation from the perspective of something that was not there to witness it. The description sounds like religious mania, except for the details. The monk drew geometric patterns he saw in the chamber. He wrote down mathematical formulas he claimed were inscribed on the walls. Modern scholars examining these drawings note they are consistent with theoretical physics concepts, not formalized until the 20th century. Concepts involving space-time geometry, wave functions, and dimensional mathematics that wouldn't be developed for another 500 years after this monk supposedly copied them from ancient temple walls. The Vatican's interest wasn't purely suppressive. Internal documents show the Church has been trying to understand these chambers for centuries, conducting quiet investigations and developing theories about what ancient Egyptians discovered or preserved. Vatican archaeologists have proposed internally that sealed chambers might contain information or technology from a pre-Diluvian civilization, the advanced pre-flood world mentioned in Genesis. This theory would explain both the Church's interest and their suppression. Evidence of advanced pre-flood civilization would validate biblical accounts of a destroyed ancient world, but it would also raise uncomfortable questions about what that civilization knew, how advanced they were, and why their knowledge was lost or hidden rather than preserved for humanity's benefit. The real validation of these archives comes from their predictive accuracy. Multiple times, Vatican documents described sealed chambers in specific locations, decades or centuries before modern archaeology officially discovered them. A 1650 report details a chamber beneath the Sphinx's pores containing tablets of the flood time, in a location that wouldn't be scanned and confirmed until the 1990 seconds. A 1789 letter references a sealed chamber near Abydos, where time runs backward, describing spatial disorientation effects, identical to those reported by researchers who entered a chamber at that location in 2004. These aren't vague prophecies or lucky guesses. They're specific architectural descriptions and documented effects that match modern findings with uncomfortable precision. The archives also contain something more current and more damning correspondence between modern popes and Egyptian authorities, discussing specific chambers and agreeing to mutual suppression of findings. A 1974 letter from Pope Paul VI to Egyptian President Sadat explicitly discusses a newly discovered chamber and the need to coordinate our response to ensure stability of established historical frameworks. A 1998 memo references a chamber containing pre-hieroglyphic writing systems and confirms both parties agreed to classify its location and restrict access indefinitely. This isn't ancient history being debated by scholars. This is modern coordinated information control at the highest levels of government and religious authority. The Vatican has been documenting sealed Egyptian chambers since the Crusades. Their archives contain first-person accounts from the 1400s, describing what's inside, accounts that match modern reports from sealed chambers exactly. Medieval monks had the same experiences as 21st century archaeologists. What does that tell you? But the Vatican isn't just collecting information, they're actively involved in modern excavations, and not just as observers. Leaked emails from 2012 show Vatican representatives explicitly requesting certain chambers remain sealed, and not for religious reasons. Their justification was far stranger. Knowledge, retrieval, timing protocols. What does that mean? Who decided there's a right time to open these chambers? And what are they waiting for? In 2012, Egyptian workers discovered a previously unknown chamber beneath the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. Standard procedure required notification of antiquities officials and assessment of the chamber's contents and condition. What happened instead was a flurry of encrypted communications between Cairo and Vatican City. One of those emails was leaked to Italian journalists in 2015. Its contents raised questions that have never been adequately answered. The email, sent from a Vatican archaeologist to Egyptian antiquities officials, explicitly recommended the chamber remain sealed. The justification wasn't religious doctrine or preservation concerns. The email stated the chamber should not be opened until celestial and terrestrial conditions align with safe knowledge retrieval parameters. It referenced something called timing protocols and suggested the chamber wasn't on the approved access list for the current assessment period. This phrasing is bizarre. Archaeological sites don't have access schedules based on celestial alignments. Knowledge doesn't require safe retrieval parameters, unless what's being retrieved is somehow dangerous or active, rather than merely historical. Yet the email discussed these concepts as if they were standard operating procedures that both parties understood and accepted. Several interpretations emerged. The astronomical interpretation suggests certain chambers can only be safely entered during specific celestial alignments, matching ancient Egyptian inscriptions that specified entry times based on star positions. The reference to terrestrial conditions could mean geological factors, seismic stability, electromagnetic field variations, groundwater levels that follow predictable cyclical patterns. Perhaps ancient builders deliberately placed certain chambers in locations where these factors create hazardous conditions except during specific windows. The technological interpretation proposes that safely exploring these chambers requires capabilities we haven't yet developed. Someone, somewhere, is tracking technological advancement against readiness criteria, determining when humanity possesses the tools to interact with these spaces without causing damage to the chambers or ourselves. The theological interpretation suggests the Vatican believes there's a divinely ordained timeline for humanity to discover certain knowledge. Premature discovery would be catastrophic in ways that transcend archaeological concerns. Most intriguing is the phrase knowledge retrieval, rather than archaeological investigation. It implies whatever is in sealed chambers isn't just artifacts to be studied, but active information that could be accessed or activated, as if the chambers function less like tombs and more like time capsules designed to release specific information when specific conditions are met. Investigation into whether formal timing protocols actually exist revealed something disturbing. Multiple sources, with no apparent connection to each other, independently reference a document called the Horizon Chronology, supposedly maintained jointly by Vatican scholars and Egyptian authorities. This document allegedly lists sealed chambers and calculated safe opening dates for each, based on criteria combining astronomy, technological assessment, and factors that remain unclear. No one has produced this document, but too many people reference it with too much specific detail for it to be complete fabrication. Some dates have allegedly already passed. Certain chambers could theoretically be opened now according to whatever calculation method the protocols use. Yet those chambers remain sealed, suggesting the timing protocols are either incorrect, have been overridden by other concerns, or there are multiple criteria that must all be satisfied simultaneously before access is granted. A leaked Vatican email from 2012 said a newly discovered chamber should stay sealed until celestial and terrestrial conditions align. This wasn't religious language, it was technical protocol, referencing a TEM document that allegedly calculates when humanity is ready to know what's inside. Some of those dates have already passed. The chambers stay sealed anyway. So authorities have reasons, perhaps legitimate reasons, to keep chambers sealed. But that begs the obvious question. What could possibly be inside these chambers that requires centuries of coordination, Vatican involvement, classified timing protocols, and people dying to keep secret? Let's talk about the theories, because some of them are supported by more evidence than you'd think. Edgar Cayce was a psychic from Kentucky who claimed to enter trance states and receive information from what he called the Akashic Records, a cosmic library of all human knowledge and history. During the 1,930 seconds, he made hundreds of predictions about a chamber beneath the Sphinx containing comprehensive records of Atlantis and human civilization spanning tens of thousands of years, including advanced technological knowledge. He described its exact location, beneath the right paw of the Sphinx, accessed through a chamber connected by a passage. He said it would be discovered before the end of the 20th century. Cayce died in 1945. In 1991, ground-penetrating radar confirmed a large rectangular chamber beneath the Sphinx's paws, exactly where he described it. Egyptian authorities acknowledged the chamber's existence, but declared it structurally unsound and refused excavation permits. The chamber remains unopened. Everyone agrees it's there. No one agrees to look inside. This is either the most remarkable coincidence in archaeological history, or validation that Cayce accessed information through means we don't understand. But Cayce wasn't describing something unique to his psychic visions. Ancient Egyptian texts themselves reference houses of life and chambers of the first time, where knowledge from the pre-dynastic era was preserved. These weren't metaphorical concepts. Egyptian priests referred to physical locations where written records, artifacts, and teaching materials were stored from a golden age before the dynastic period, a time when Egypt was supposedly governed by gods or beings with godlike knowledge. The architectural evidence supports this. Several sealed chambers have been scanned thoroughly enough to show internal configurations. Some contain what appear to be shelving systems. Others show storage arrangements with regular spacing, suggesting organized placement of objects. At least one chamber shows shapes consistent with crystal or mineral storage materials that could theoretically preserve information far longer than organic materials like papyrus or even stone carvings, which erode over millennia. What modern explorers report from brief glimpses of sealed chambers adds another layer. Walls covered not in typical hieroglyphics, but in dense, technical notations. Symbols mixing hieroglyphic characters with mathematical notation and star charts of unusual sophistication. Not decorative art, not religious texts. Documentation that looks like technical manuals or reference materials. The kind of comprehensive notation you'd use if you were trying to preserve specific knowledge in as much detail as possible for people who might not share your language or cultural context. What might such records contain? The possibilities align with gaps in our understanding of ancient Egyptian knowledge. Astronomical information about planetary cycles spanning millennia, calculations that would require centuries of observation to compile. Medical and biological information, including concepts about genetics, cellular function, and human anatomy that Egyptian physicians seem to understand, despite lacking microscopes. Mathematical and engineering principles, explaining how monuments were constructed with precision that challenges modern capabilities. Geographical knowledge of lands that are now underwater, coastlines that have changed since the last ice age ended. Historical accounts of civilizations that existed before Egypt, during periods mainstream archaeology considers prehistoric. Preserving such knowledge in sealed chambers makes practical sense. Physical books decay, papyrus crumbles, even stone inscriptions erode. But information carved in deep underground chambers, sealed to prevent environmental degradation, designed specifically for millennia-long preservation that could survive global catastrophes, climate changes, civilization collapse. If you possessed comprehensive knowledge and wanted to ensure it survived for future civilizations that might need it, sealing it in chambers beneath the most permanent structures you could build would be logical. The obvious question surfaces immediately. If ancient Egyptians possessed or inherited such advanced knowledge, why don't we see more evidence of it in their civilization? Several theories attempt to explain this gap. Perhaps the knowledge was inherited from an earlier civilization, but not fully understood by the Egyptians who preserved it. They were custodians rather than creators. Perhaps it was deliberately restricted to priesthood elite and never widely applied, kept secret to maintain their authority. Or perhaps it was recorded specifically for future civilizations rather than contemporary use. A time capsule intended for humanity at a different developmental stage, not for the Egyptians themselves. The most radical possibility reframes everything. What if sealed chambers aren't just passive records but active knowledge transfer systems? What if entering them with proper preparation allows information transfer through means we don't understand? This would explain the psychological effects, not hallucinations or environmental toxins, but actual information transmission that human consciousness isn't naturally equipped to process without preparation. It would explain why ancient protocols included specific mental and physical preparation rituals before entering certain chambers. Not superstition. Practical necessity for interfacing with a knowledge transfer system designed by a civilization with different capabilities. This recontextualizes sealed chambers entirely. Not libraries where you read information passively. Something closer to educational technology we haven't learned to operate properly. Perhaps the deaths and psychological breaks occur when unprepared minds encounter information, transfer systems still functioning after thousands of years. Perhaps the warnings weren't about physical dangers but about consciousness-level interactions that could damage unprepared individuals. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed a large chamber beneath the Sphinx's paws, in exactly the location Edgar Cayce predicted in 1933, before such technology existed. He called it the Hall of Records. Egyptian texts call it the Chamber of the First Time. Authorities call it structurally unsound and won't excavate it, but everyone agrees it's there. Records of lost knowledge would explain the Vatican's interest and the security protocols. But there's a darker theory, one that takes into account the deaths, the psychological effects, and the warnings about what sleeps without breathing. What if some chambers don't contain records of knowledge? What if they contain the source of it? Ancient Egyptians believed consciousness could exist independent of biological activity. They believed certain beings could exist in suspended states between life and death. They believed death wasn't always permanent. We classify these as religious beliefs, metaphysical concepts without physical reality. But Egyptian medical knowledge was remarkably sophisticated. They understood organ function, body systems, surgical procedures, and preservation techniques that kept organic tissue intact for thousands of years. They weren't primitive people attributing magic to things they couldn't explain. They were precise, methodical, and their beliefs about consciousness and suspended states were treated with the same practical attention as their anatomical knowledge. What if the sealed chambers were designed to preserve something biological or semi-biological? What if ancient warnings about those who sleep without breathing should be taken literally? The physical evidence from sealed chambers that have been briefly explored raises questions mainstream archaeology doesn't want to address. Sarcophagi that contain no bodies but show signs of having been occupied. Interior surfaces marked by patterns suggesting movement or pressure from inside. Not the kind of wear you'd expect from empty stone boxes sitting undisturbed for millennia. the kind of marks that suggest something was in there and moved. Then there are the biological contamination incidents. Unidentified organic compounds found in sealed chambers, compounds that don't match any known ancient biological material, but also don't match any modern contamination source. When samples from the Osiris Shaft underwent DNA analysis, researchers found fragments they initially classified as contamination because the sequences didn't match human or any catalogued organism. But the fragments were too complex and too consistent across multiple independent samples to be simple contamination. They showed sophisticated genetic structures. They just didn't match anything in existing databases. So what exactly produced genetic material that's complex enough to be intentional but doesn't match known life? Accounts of presences in chambers have been reported consistently across centuries. Medieval monks feeling watched. Modern researchers experiencing the sensation of sharing space with something aware. Team members independently describing the same feeling of presence in specific chambers. Dismissing these all as hallucination requires ignoring extensive documentation from people who had no reason to fabricate similar stories and no contact with each other's reports. The scientific framework for biological preservation exists. Cryptobiosis, the state, some organisms like tardigrades enter where metabolic activity becomes nearly undetectable, allows survival for decades or longer. Hibernation states that some mammals demonstrate that consciousness can be suspended, while biological processes maintain minimal function. Theoretical suspended animation states that human cells might be capable of, under precise conditions, have been researched for space travel and medical applications. If ancient Egyptians developed such techniques, perhaps inherited them from an earlier civilization, sealed chambers might function as preservation chambers for entities they wanted both protected and isolated. Protected suggests value. Isolated suggests danger. Both together suggest something they considered worth preserving at any cost, while ensuring it couldn't interact with the outside world until specific conditions were met. This framework explains why elaborate warnings and ritual protocols surrounded certain chambers. Not superstition. Practical safety measures for handling biologics in suspended states. If you're preserving something that could become active again, you need protocols for who can access it, under what conditions, and what preparations are necessary to avoid contamination or uncontrolled activation. The electromagnetic readings from sealed chambers take on new meaning in this context. Some researchers note the patterns resemble bioelectrical signatures, the electromagnetic fields generated by living neural or cellular activity. If preserved entities maintain minimal biological or electromagnetic function, they wouldn't be completely inactive. They'd be sleeping in the most literal sense. Consciousness suspended but not extinguished. Biological processes reduced to nearly undetectable levels, but still present. What happens if sealed chambers are opened carelessly, and something preserved there becomes active again? Exposure to modern pathogens it has no immunity to. Inability to survive in atmospheric conditions that have changed over millennia. Or, worst case, biological contamination spreading from preserved entities to modern humans. Pathogens that have been isolated for thousands of years suddenly encountering populations with no natural immunity. The epidemiological implications alone would justify extreme caution. This could explain the deaths. Not environmental toxins or accidents. Biological exposure to something our immune systems aren't prepared to handle. It would explain the extreme quarantine measures taken after certain chamber breaches. It would explain why some chambers were not just sealed but welded shut, or permanently filled with concrete not to prevent theft or preserve artifacts, but to ensure permanent containment of biological materials too dangerous to risk exposure. The most unsettling aspect is the possibility that whatever was preserved was deliberately chosen. The last remnants of a pre-dynastic civilization. Individuals who possessed critical knowledge. Entities whose consciousness or biological material was considered essential to preserve for a future time when they could be safely studied or, more disturbingly, safely revived. The Egyptian concept of resurrection wasn't necessarily metaphorical. Their entire mortuary practice centered on physical preservation of bodies under the belief that consciousness could be restored to them under correct conditions. What if they actually knew how to do it? What if sealed chambers contain not just mummified corpses intended symbolically for the afterlife, but preserved entities in suspended states, waiting for conditions that would allow their revival? What if opening chambers prematurely isn't dangerous because of environmental conditions, but because we lack the knowledge to safely manage whatever awakening process might begin when preservation seals are broken. Ancient Egyptian warnings say, "Those who sleep without breathing wait in sealed chambers." We thought it was metaphor. Then, DNA analysis of samples from the Osiris Shaft found genetic material that doesn't match humans or any known organism. It was too complex to be contamination. So, what exactly is sleeping down there? Whether sealed chambers contain knowledge, or something living, or both, there's one theory that connects everything we've discussed. That ancient Egyptians weren't just protecting these chambers from us. They were protecting us from what's inside. And they left instructions for a future time when we'd be advanced enough to handle it safely. But there's a problem with waiting. Some people don't want to wait. Electromagnetic readings from sealed chambers show patterns that don't match natural geological phenomena. They show active fields, electrical or magnetic, generated by sources inside chambers that have been sealed for thousands of years. The fields fluctuate in patterns, suggesting artificial generation rather than passive mineral deposits. They respond to external electromagnetic changes in ways that suggest active systems rather than inert materials. Something inside those chambers is generating power, or storing it, or both. The accounts of devices witnessed briefly in sealed chambers span decades and continents, but describe remarkably similar objects. Bergmann's 1936 expedition reported crystalline mechanisms arranged in geometric arrays that he couldn't approach due to disorientation effects. The 1923 Serapeum team described a metal pillar that vibrated at frequencies that killed a man who touched it. Leaked footage from the 2009 Saqqara chamber shows what the exploration team called a perfect crystal sphere, approximately 1 meter in diameter, sitting in a chamber with walls too smooth to have been carved with. Ancient tools. These aren't decorative objects. They're described consistently as mechanisms, things with apparent function and purpose, not artistic or religious items. Some sealed chambers require specific external configurations to access. Precise alignments of metal objects, in particular geometric arrangements. Specific sequences of movements that suggest locking mechanisms far more sophisticated than stone doors moved by counterweights. The complexity implies the chambers weren't just sealed for security, but designed to open only when specific conditions were met, conditions that might require technology to create. The D-Jade pillar is one of ancient Egypt's most important symbols, representing stability and endurance. It appears thousands of times in art, architecture, and religious contexts. It also looks remarkably like a modern electrical component, specifically a capacitor or layered conductor designed to store electrical charge. The similarity is too precise to be coincidental. Multiple engineers examining the symbol have noted the structural correspondence between D-Jade pillars and electrical storage devices. What if it wasn't symbolic? What if Egyptian priests carried or installed functional devices whose purpose we've forgotten, leaving only the symbolic representation in art? Egyptian astronomical knowledge demonstrates capabilities that puzzle modern scholars. They predicted eclipses thousands of years in advance. They tracked planetary cycles across millennia. They aligned massive structures to stellar positions with precision that requires understanding of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. This knowledge implies either thousands of years of continuous observation or access to calculating tools sophisticated enough to model celestial mechanics without direct observation. Stone Age tools and naked-eye astronomy don't explain this level of precision. Calculating devices would. Information storage systems that preserved astronomical data across generations would. Technology we've classified as modern because we can't imagine ancient civilizations possessing it. Perhaps sealed chambers contain energy generation devices. Several ancient Egyptian symbols show remarkable similarity to modern electrical components, not just D-Jade pillars, but with scepters resembling insulators and Ankh symbols that engineers note resemble closed-loop electrical circuits. Perhaps they contain information storage systems using crystalline structures, similar to modern optical or quantum storage concepts that use atomic structures to encode data. Perhaps they contain calculation devices that enabled the mathematical and astronomical achievements Egyptian priests demonstrated. If such technology exists in sealed chambers and remains functional, the implications would be revolutionary and destabilizing. Both the potential benefits, leapfrogging technological development by reverse engineering ancient devices, and the dangers technology we don't understand, operating in ways we can't control, would justify extreme secrecy and restricted access. The skeptical question arises: if such technology existed, why didn't it revolutionize ancient Egyptian civilization? Perhaps it did. The precision of pyramid construction, the astronomical knowledge, the medical capabilities, all suggest application of principles we struggle to explain with available tools. Or perhaps the technology was inherited from an earlier civilization, but wasn't fully understood or couldn't be replicated with available resources. Egyptian priests might have been operators rather than engineers, following protocols without fully understanding the underlying principles. The D-jade pillar, ancient Egypt's symbol of stability, looks remarkably like a modern electrical capacitor. The device sealed in the Serapeum chamber was described as a vibrating metal pillar that killed a man who touched it. Egyptian priests could predict eclipses thousands of years in advance. What if they weren't just smart? What if they had tools? Theories are one thing, but some people didn't theorize they entered sealed chambers and survived to talk about it, at least for a while. Their testimonies are the most direct evidence we have, and what they describe is consistent, specific, and utterly inexplicable. Let's hear from the people who actually went inside. The 12th of October, 1973. Dr. Margaret Holbrook, a Cambridge Egyptologist specializing in Middle Kingdom religious texts, entered a sealed chamber that had been discovered weeks earlier as an annex to Seti I's tomb. She was brought to Egypt specifically to document the chamber's inscriptions. Her expertise in religious texts made her the obvious choice for cataloguing what authorities expected to be standard funerary material. She entered the chamber at 2:15 the afternoon, accompanied by 2 Egyptian workers who remained in the outer chamber while she proceeded alone into the inner room with her camera and notebook. Standard archaeological documentation. She was expected to spend an hour, maybe 2 at most, photographing walls and recording preliminary observations. She emerged 3 hours later. Something fundamental had changed. The workers noticed immediately. She was speaking to them in a language they didn't understand, not English, not Arabic. When Egyptian officials arrived, they recognized what they were hearing: Middle Egyptian. Not the reconstructed academic pronunciation Egyptologists use when reading hieroglyphics aloud, but fluent speech with correct intonation, colloquialisms, grammatical structures that scholars note would be impossible to reconstruct from academic study alone. She was speaking a language that had been dead for over 3,000 years, as if it were her native tongue. The linguistic shift didn't fade after a few hours. It persisted for 6 months. During that period, Holbrook underwent extensive neurological examination. Brain scans showed unusual activity, heightened function in language centers, but also in areas associated with memory retrieval. Except she wasn't experiencing this as memory. She described it as present knowledge, information she simply knew without remembering learning it. During those 6 months, she produced detailed drawings, architectural plans of Egyptian sites she'd never visited. When expeditions later investigated those locations, they found chambers exactly as she'd drawn them, dimensions, doorways, internal features, all matching her sketches. She described Egyptian daily life, with specifics that matched archaeological evidence discovered years after her experience. Manufacturing techniques, agricultural practices, social customs, things that weren't in any academic text she could have accessed. Her own account of what happened inside the chamber, given in interviews years later after she'd recovered enough linguistic normalcy to communicate with modern English speakers, described something that doesn't fit conventional categories of experience. She didn't hallucinate seeing ancient Egyptians. She didn't have visions of the past. She experienced what she called simultaneous awareness of multiple time periods. The chamber was empty and occupied, modern and ancient, sealed and open, all simultaneously. Not conflicting perceptions, but layered reality she could distinguish and navigate. She described it as accessing information stored in the space itself like a recording that played through me rather than to me. This wasn't gradual knowledge acquisition. It was immediate comprehension of information she had no framework for possessing. As if the chamber contained not carved inscriptions to be read, but encoded information that could be directly apprehended by consciousness, prepared to receive it or in her case, unprepared consciousness, that happened to be receptive. The implications troubled her more than the experience itself. If chambers can transfer information directly to human consciousness, it explains both why ancient Egyptians valued preserving these spaces and why they created elaborate protocols for entering them. Not for spiritual protection, but to prepare the mind to receive and process information in formats normal waking awareness can't handle. The rituals weren't superstition. They were necessary training for safe interface with knowledge preservation technology we've lost the ability to use. Holbrook developed a theory during her recovery period, one she refined over the following decades. These chambers aren't libraries, they're recordings. Ancient Egyptians developed a method of encoding information into physical space stone, geometry, maybe electromagnetic fields that could be directly apprehended by prepared consciousness. We've lost the preparation techniques, so modern people experience it as disorientation or contamination rather than knowledge transfer. Her later career reflected the profound impact of those 3 hours. She became increasingly reclusive. She refused all further Egyptian excavation work despite her expertise and the professional opportunities available. She spent her final decades working privately, trying to decode the architectural plans she'd drawn during her affected period plans that continued to guide her work even after her linguistic abilities returned to normal. Before her death in 2018, she claimed to have identified 3 more sealed chambers based on knowledge she'd downloaded in 1973. She provided precise coordinates, depth estimates, and architectural descriptions. Recent ground-penetrating radar scans have confirmed chambers exist in exactly those locations. With the configurations, she described chambers that hadn't been officially discovered when she drew them 45 years earlier. Dr. Margaret Holbrook entered a sealed chamber in 1973. She went in, speaking only English. She came out speaking perfect Middle Egyptian, a dead language she'd only studied academically. 6 months later, she drew architectural plans for chambers that hadn't been discovered yet. They found them exactly where she drew them. Holbrook's experience suggests information transfer, but not everyone who enters sealed chambers gains knowledge. Some lose themselves entirely. And the difference seems to be preparation, exactly what ancient warnings emphasized. Let's talk about those who entered unprepared and what happened to them. Thomas Whitmore was a British adventurer with more money than sense, and connections that bought access to places that should have remained restricted. In 1887, he bribed his way into a sealed chamber beneath the Valley of the Kings, one that local workers had refused to enter despite financial incentives far exceeding their normal wages. His diary, published by his estate after his death, documents the progression. The first day reads like standard adventure narrative. Excitement at exploring forbidden spaces, descriptions of the chamber's architecture, sketches of inscriptions. The second day shows cracks, mentions of feeling watched, difficulty maintaining focus, the unsettling sense that the chamber's geometry didn't remain consistent when he turned his back. The third day descends into incoherence, fragmentary entries about the walls breathing, and time running in circles. The handwriting deteriorates across the page. He emerged after 5 days completely catatonic. He remained institutionalized until his death 3 years later, never regaining coherent speech. Medical records note he would occasionally speak in what sounded like ancient Egyptian phonemes, though no expert was consulted to verify the language. He died without ever explaining what happened in those final days inside the chamber. Chen was a modern urban explorer who documented abandoned and restricted sites for an online audience. In 2008, she and 2 friends illegally entered a sealed chamber at Saqqara, filming the entire incursion. The footage shows initial excitement, the thrill of being somewhere forbidden, the awe at seeing spaces untouched for millennia. Then growing unease as they realized they were lost, despite the chamber being relatively small with only 1 entrance. Chen began experiencing severe temporal disorientation. She insisted hours had passed when her companions' watches showed only minutes. Then she claimed only minutes had passed when her friends insisted they'd been inside for hours. Their phones had stopped working, no signal, but also the clocks had frozen at different times on each device. When they finally escaped after what their external cameras confirmed was 6 hours, medical examination documented something that shouldn't be possible. Chen had aged. Not psychological stress aging. Physical aging. Rapid advancement of aging markers that medical science has no framework for explaining. Telomere shortening that should take years. skin elasticity loss, organ changes measured through enzyme markers that indicated years of biological time had passed. The condition stabilized but never reversed. Sarah Chen effectively aged several years in one night. The medical documentation exists in peer-reviewed journals. The explanations offered range from unprecedented stress response to measurement error, neither of which accounts for the consistent markers across multiple tests by different medical teams. In 2015, an Egyptian worker whose name was never released publicly was sent to check structural stability of a newly discovered chamber. He was inside less than 30 minutes. When he emerged, he reported to supervisors that he'd encountered someone else in the sealed chamber, a figure he described as present but not there, watching but not seeing. Within weeks, he developed symptoms resembling severe PTSD, but with elements that didn't fit the diagnosis. Inability to tolerate artificial light. Obsessive concern about specific dates, centuries in the past, dates he had no historical knowledge of but insisted were critically important. Periodic episodes where his family insisted he spoke in voices and linguistic patterns that weren't his own, not possession in any religious sense. Just intervals where his speech patterns, word choices, and vocal mannerisms completely changed to something they didn't recognize. These cases share common elements: entry without preparation, prolonged exposure without protection, life-altering consequences that persist long after leaving the chamber. The severity correlates with time spent inside, and perhaps with the specific chamber entered. Some locations seem more dangerous than others, as if whatever effect these spaces produce varies in intensity. Most significantly, these unprepared explorers gained nothing beneficial from their experiences. No knowledge transfer like Holbrook experienced, just psychological and physical damage. This suggests preparation isn't superstitious ritual, but necessary protection for consciousness or physiology when exposed to whatever exists in sealed chambers. Without it, the mind or body experiences these spaces as attack rather than education. Sarah Chen entered a sealed chamber in 2008 for 6 hours. Medical examination afterward confirmed she'd aged several years in that time. Physically aged, not psychological stress. Her telomeres showed years of shortening. Her organs showed years of use. It's documented in medical journals. No one can explain it. So, entering unprepared causes harm. But what about those who prepared correctly using ancient protocols? Bergmann did it successfully in 1936. Are there others? And what did they learn that made Nazi Germany classify their findings as critical to state security? Intelligence reports from 1951 reference something called the Luxor incident in fragmentary documents that were declassified decades later with heavy redactions. What can be pieced together describes a group of Egyptian scholars who allegedly gained access to a restricted chamber using preparation protocols they'd reconstructed from translated texts. They emerged unharmed after spending multiple days inside, not minutes or hours, but days. What happened afterward is documented in their subsequent careers. These scholars, who had previously worked in conventional academic fields, suddenly demonstrated advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics far beyond their training. They didn't claim to have learned this information in any conventional sense. They described it as something they now understood, immediate comprehension of principles they had no prior framework for grasping. The Egyptian government reportedly recruited the entire group for technical projects. Their careers showed unusual achievement in fields where they had no prior training or expertise. One became a leading engineer despite having been a literature professor. Another made contributions to theoretical physics despite no formal background in the field. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. In 1962, Father Alessandro Rossi, a Vatican archaeologist, entered a chamber at Abydos, following protocols discovered in Vatican archives. Fragments of his report were leaked in 2016. He described the experience as interfacing with a system of knowledge presentation far beyond our educational methodologies. Not reading, not learning. Interfacing, the word choice suggests direct transmission rather than conventional study. He emerged with detailed understanding of ancient Egyptian medicine that he hadn't possessed before entering, specifically surgical procedures. He taught these techniques to modern surgeons. They worked. His technique for cataract surgery, which he attributed entirely to knowledge gained in the chamber, is still used today. Modern ophthalmologists who've studied his method note it's more efficient than techniques developed through conventional medical research, requiring fewer incisions and producing faster recovery times. Rossi spent the rest of his life attempting to develop modern versions of ancient preparation protocols. He believed the techniques could be systematized and taught, turning chamber exploration from dangerous, unpredictable experience into reliable knowledge acquisition method. Then there's the alleged Warsaw Protocol incident of 1987. Polish researchers supposedly combined ancient Egyptian rituals with modern meditation and consciousness techniques, creating a preparation procedure that merged historical and contemporary approaches. Reports suggest they entered a sealed chamber, documented it successfully, and experienced information transfer without the psychological damage that unprepared explorers suffered. The work was classified by both Polish and Egyptian authorities. But the subsequent careers of the alleged participants show patterns similar to the Luxor group: unusual expertise in fields where they had no formal training, publications in disciplines ranging from theoretical physics to ancient history, contributions that colleagues described as coming from intuitive understanding rather than conventional research. What successful preparation involves remains partially unclear, reconstructed from fragmentary accounts and leaked documents. Specific psychological conditioning meditation, consciousness exercises designed to alter normal perceptual frameworks. Physiological preparation, possibly including dietary restrictions and substances that alter brain chemistry. Timing aligned with astronomical phenomena, suggesting the chamber's effects vary based on celestial configurations. Physical arrangements in the chamber before entry, the geometric metal configurations Bergmann used, specific orientations and positions. The common element is preparation of consciousness to receive information in formats normal waking awareness can't process. This recontextualizes ancient Egyptian priesthood training entirely. The elaborate initiation rituals, the years of preparation before certain individuals were allowed to enter specific chambers. This wasn't mysticism or religious theater. It was practical skill development, training consciousness to interface safely with knowledge, preservation systems that operate outside conventional educational frameworks. If sealed chambers are technology designed to transfer information directly to prepared minds, then learning to use them safely isn't spiritual practice. It's technical training. Like learning to operate complex equipment that requires specific mental states to function without causing harm to the operator. In 1962, a Vatican priest followed ancient protocols and entered a sealed chamber at Abydos. He emerged able to perform ancient Egyptian surgical procedures he'd never studied. He taught them to modern surgeons. They work. His technique for cataract surgery is still used today. Where did he learn it? So sealed chambers can be entered safely with proper preparation, and the prepared ones gained knowledge. But here's what makes all of this even stranger. Sealed chambers aren't unique to Egypt. Similar structures exist worldwide, constructed by cultures that supposedly never had contact. And they share the same characteristics, the same warnings, and the same patterns of suppression. This isn't just about Egypt, it's global. In 1992, a resident of Longyu County, China, decided to pump water from what he assumed was a natural pond on his property. The water level dropped, and kept dropping. When the pond was finally drained, it revealed something that shouldn't exist. Massive underground chambers carved with precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. No tool marks on the walls. Perfect right angles. Chambers at depths where the limestone should have collapsed under its own weight centuries ago. The Longyu Caves, as they're now called, were clearly artificial. Someone carved millions of cubic feet of rock from these spaces, using methods that left surfaces smooth as modern machining. Chinese authorities responded quickly, allowing limited tourism to outer chambers while sealing the deepest levels. Workers who accessed restricted sections before the seal reported electromagnetic anomalies and equipment malfunctions. Cameras stopped working. Digital devices recorded strange interference patterns. The deepest chambers remained closed with official explanations, citing structural concerns and ongoing research that never seems to conclude. Malta's Hal Saflieni Hypogeum is a multi-level underground structure carved into solid limestone, officially dated to 3600 BCE, but potentially far older based on water erosion patterns. The lowest levels have been closed to public access for decades. Authorities cite conservation concerns. The real issue might be the oracle chamber, a room engineered to produce specific sound frequencies that affect human consciousness. Researchers who studied the chamber before modern restrictions reported experiencing visions and altered mental states when certain tones were produced. Acoustic testing revealed the space was deliberately designed to generate frequencies known to affect brain function, particularly the prefrontal cortex and areas associated with altered consciousness. The engineering required to create such precise acoustic properties predates any known civilization with that level of sonic understanding. Off Japan's coast lies the Yonaguni Monument, a submerged structure showing clear evidence of artificial shaping. The site includes chambers that would have been above water during the last ice age, over 12,000 years ago. The deepest sections contain sealed doorways, carved stone barriers that block access to interior spaces. Japanese authorities have refused permits to breach these seals, citing preservation concerns despite the structure being continuously exposed to ocean currents that should negate any preservation benefit from keeping specific doorways closed. Whatever is behind those seals, authorities have decided it should remain there. The Bosnian pyramid complex remains controversial. Mainstream archaeology dismisses the structures as natural formations despite geometric properties and tunnel systems that show clear evidence of artificial construction. Underground chambers beneath the complex share characteristics with Egyptian examples. Electromagnetic anomalies measuring higher than ambient background levels, precise geometric construction, and strictly restricted access by authorities who deny permits to independent researchers while conducting their own classified studies. Spanish conquistadors, exploring pre-Columbian temples in Peru and Bolivia, documented underground chambers they encountered before the Catholic Church sealed them. Colonial records describe rooms of stars and chambers of the old gods that priests deemed dangerous to Spanish souls. The Church ordered these spaces closed and built colonial structures over them to prevent access. Some have never been reopened. Modern governments maintain the restrictions despite archaeological interest and ground-penetrating radar detection of significant chambers that could revolutionize understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. These structures share specific characteristics: extreme precision in construction, exceeding the supposed technological capabilities of their builders; electromagnetic or acoustic anomalies measuring distinctly different from surrounding areas; psychological effects reported by visitors ranging from altered consciousness to physical symptoms; astronomical alignments to celestial events or geographic features; and modern restrictions on access using remarkably similar official justifications across different countries and cultures. Most significantly, they all contain sealed inner chambers, not just closed-sealed, deliberately blocked with barriers designed for permanence, marked with warnings, or left completely unmarked, but consistently restricted from access. The seal itself appears to be the important feature, preserved across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Ground-penetrating radar has detected similar sealed chambers beneath major ancient sites worldwide. Beneath Angkor Wat in Cambodia, scans show extensive underground chambers that Cambodian authorities refuse to excavate. Beneath Machu Picchu in Peru, radar indicates sealed spaces within the mountain that Peruvian officials classify as structurally unsafe to explore despite modern engineering capabilities. Around Easter Island's Moai structures, subsurface scanning detected chambers that Chilean authorities have declared off-limits to researchers without providing coherent justification. This isn't isolated Egyptian peculiarity. It's a global phenomenon of ancient sealed spaces that authorities across many countries have independently decided should remain sealed, using the same excuses despite having no obvious coordination or shared interest. The pattern implies one of two possibilities. Either multiple cultures independently discovered something that required sealing something they all recognized as needing isolation from future civilizations, something so universal in its danger or value that cultures separated by oceans reached identical conclusions about preservation through sealing. Or there was a shared knowledge system across the ancient world, a global network of information exchange during humanity's deep past, where protocols for constructing and sealing chambers for specific purposes were transmitted across cultures that mainstream history insists never contacted each other. China discovered massive precision-carved underground chambers in 1992. They're architectural impossibilities that shouldn't exist with ancient tools. The deepest levels have been sealed since discovery. Malta has underground chambers that affect human consciousness through sound, also sealed. Japan has submerged chambers with sealed doorways. Egypt isn't unique. Every ancient civilization sealed something underground. They're all still sealed. These aren't random caves or tombs. They're engineered structures built to specific designs, sealed deliberately, and protected by modern authorities who all use the same excuses. Conservation, structural instability, not historically significant. What if they were all built for the same purpose? What if ancient civilizations worldwide were preserving or containing something using the same basic technology? Here's what the evidence suggests. Many sealed chambers globally were closed at approximately the same historical moment, not over centuries of gradual cultural change. At roughly the same time, sometime between 10,000 and 3,000 years BCE, cultures worldwide sealed underground chambers and never reopened them, despite those civilizations continuing for thousands of years afterward. The geological and archaeological data shows chambers containing no evidence of use after a certain period. These spaces were constructed, used briefly, then sealed and revered but not re-entered. Civilizations maintained the sites above ground, built temples, conducted ceremonies, but the sealed chambers beneath remained closed, even when those same cultures demonstrated capability and willingness to excavate extensively for other purposes. The mythological evidence aligns disturbingly well with this timeline. Cultures worldwide preserve legends of a time when knowledge was more freely available, when beings of greater wisdom walked among humans, when secrets were openly taught. These golden ages end in the myths with knowledge being sealed, wisdom being hidden, or the wise ones departing. These transitions consistently occur during the period matching the end of the last ice age roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, when massive climate change occurred globally. The linguistic evidence adds another layer. Scholars examining ancient languages from cultures with no known contact note, remarkably similar root words for concepts related to sealed spaces, hidden knowledge, and the time before. This suggests either shared linguistic origin during humanity's deeper past, or sustained contact between ancient cultures that conventional history insists were isolated from each other. What might cause a global sealing event? A cataclysm that prompted preservation of knowledge before civilizations collapsed. A deliberate decision by an advanced ancient civilization to seal dangerous knowledge or valuable materials when they realized their end was approaching. Or an astronomical or cosmic event that made certain chambers too dangerous to access for a prolonged period, requiring sealing until conditions changed. The Younger Dryas impact theory proposes that comet fragments struck Earth around 10,800 BCE, causing massive climate disruption, extinction events, and the collapse of advanced cultures that may have existed during the preceding period. Geological evidence supports the impact. Ice cores show the climate shift. Sediment layers contain materials consistent with extraterrestrial impact. If advanced civilizations existed before this event, civilizations capable of precise construction and sophisticated knowledge, they might have had enough warning to seal their most important knowledge or most dangerous materials before. Collapse. This creates an unsettling possibility. Sealed chambers were closed to protect contents from surface conditions during a known cataclysmic period. The intention was to reopen them when conditions stabilized. But the civilizations that performed the sealing collapsed during the catastrophe. The knowledge of what was inside, why it was sealed, and what safely accessing it required was lost when those civilizations died. Modern humanity is discovering sealed chambers without the instruction manual. We're finding preservation systems created by people who knew what they were preserving and why. We're trying to reverse engineer their purpose without the context that made the sealing necessary. We're dealing with time capsules from a lost civilization knowledge, technology, possibly biological materials, or entities preserved through Earth's most recent major catastrophe. And we have no reliable way to determine what opening them safely requires because the people who sealed them never passed that information forward. If the sealing event was timed to a cosmic cycle, astronomical events that repeat on predictable timelines, there might be a reason authorities calculate safe opening dates based on celestial alignments. They're trying to determine when conditions match those that existed before the sealing, when whatever made these chambers dangerous or valuable operates under the same parameters that their builders understood. Sealed chambers worldwide were closed at approximately the same time in human history, around the end of the last ice age, when comet impacts triggered massive climate catastrophe. Cultures that built them continued for thousands of years, but never reopened them. What if they weren't locking something in? What if they were preserving something through a cataclysm they knew was coming? If sealed chambers were closed to preserve something through catastrophe, the question becomes, why haven't we opened them now that the catastrophe is over? The answer is chilling, because authorities suspect the catastrophe might not be over, that the cycle might repeat, and that sealed chambers contain either the knowledge to survive what's coming, or something that must stay sealed until after the next cycle completes. The astronomical alignments of sealed chambers worldwide point to celestial events on cycles of 12,000 to 13,000 years. This matches precisely the period between major climate disruptions in Earth's geological record. The last major disruption occurred approximately 12,000 years ago with the Younger Dryas climate event. We're approaching the completion of that cycle. Ancient texts from cultures separated by oceans describe repeating cycles of creation and destruction with suspiciously consistent timeline intervals. Egyptian texts reference the first time, and subsequent repetitions implying cyclical rather than linear history. Hindu texts describe yugas measuring thousands of years each, in repeating patterns of golden ages and collapse. Mayan calendars track cycles measuring millennia, with specific endpoints that mark transitions rather than apocalypse. Hopi traditions describe previous worlds that ended in catastrophe before the current world began. Modern science confirms cyclical Earth changes. Magnetic pole reversal cycles occur on timescales, measuring tens of thousands of years. Solar cycles of unusual activity affect Earth's climate on predictable intervals. Galactic orbital variations alter Earth's position relative to cosmic radiation sources. The planet experiences regular disruptions that geology records and astronomy predicts. What if ancient civilizations sealed chambers, not just to preserve knowledge from the last catastrophe but for the next one? What if timing protocols don't reference when humanity is ready to access what's inside, but when the cosmic cycle makes it safe or necessary because catastrophe approaches? If sealed chambers contain survival knowledge or technology needed during cyclical catastrophes, authorities might suppress exploration to prevent mass panic about coming events. Or they might be preparing to access chambers soon because they know the cycle is completing and what's inside will be needed. Recent patterns suggest preparation rather than ignorance. Increased government interest in underground facility construction. Growing academic focus on catastrophe preparedness. Suspicious coordination between multiple countries, maintaining sealed chamber restrictions despite no obvious shared interest. Nations that compete economically and politically somehow agree unanimously that ancient sealed chambers should remain closed. Maybe sealed chambers stay sealed, not because of what happened 12,000 years ago, but because of what's coming in our near future. Maybe the timing protocols calculate when chambers must be opened before the next catastrophe, rather than when humanity deserves access to ancient knowledge. Maybe authorities aren't suppressing information about our past. Maybe they're preparing for a future they know is approaching but can't publicly acknowledge without causing the exact chaos that sealed chambers were designed to help us survive. Sealed chambers globally align to astronomical events on 12,000-year cycles. The last major cycle ended with comet impacts and ice age climate collapse. We're approaching the next cycle completion. Governments are building underground facilities, and authorities suddenly care very much about keeping ancient underground chambers sealed. Coincidence? Which brings us to the final question. Given everything we know, the deaths, the knowledge, the global pattern, the cycles, why do these chambers stay sealed today? Is it protection, suppression, or preparation? The answer is probably all three. Let's look at the real reasons, the official explanations, and the decisions being made right now about humanity's access to our own ancient history. At least 17 people have died entering sealed Egyptian chambers in the past century. Multiple others suffered permanent psychological damage that ended their careers and altered their lives. Unknown biological agents have been detected in samples from sealed spaces. Equipment consistently malfunctions in ways that range from inconvenient to dangerous. These aren't conspiracy theories. They're documented facts. Maybe authorities have a point when they say some doors should stay closed until we know what we're doing. The physical hazards are measurable and real. Mercury vapor has been detected in sealed chambers at concentrations that cause neurological damage with brief exposure. Radon gas accumulates in underground spaces sealed for millennia, creating radiation exposure risk. Structural instability exists in chambers where ancient support systems have degraded over thousands of years, opening them risks collapse. These are standard archaeological hazards that require specific safety equipment and protocols. Then there are the biological unknowns. Sealed chambers preserve organic materials in unusual states. Fungal spores that have been dormant for millennia become active when sealed spaces are breached. Bacterial colonies that evolved in isolation from surface ecosystems suddenly encounter modern biology with unpredictable results. The unidentified organic compounds found in the Osiris Shaft weren't just mysterious, they were potentially pathogenic. Exposure to biological agents that human immune systems haven't encountered for thousands of years creates legitimate epidemiological concerns. The psychological effects occur consistently, even under controlled conditions. Temporal disorientation, dissociative episodes, persistent psychological changes that last months or years after brief exposure. We don't understand the mechanism. We can't predict who will be affected or how severely. But the effects are documented thoroughly enough to raise serious ethical concerns about deliberately exposing people to these environments without understanding what causes the reactions or how to prevent them. Then there's the knowledge hazard. If sealed chambers contain information or technology that modern society isn't equipped to handle responsibly, premature release could be catastrophic. This isn't paternalistic gatekeeping. It's the same logic applied to nuclear technology, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. We have technologies right now that we barely control. Introducing ancient technologies, we don't understand energy generation methods, consciousness manipulation techniques, biological engineering knowledge, could be exponentially worse. One archaeologist who advocates for continued sealing stated it clearly: some knowledge requires wisdom to use safely. If we lack that wisdom, accessing the knowledge prematurely doesn't make us wise. It makes us dangerous. Historical precedent supports careful, controlled access to hazardous discoveries. Radioactive materials required decades of research before safe handling protocols were established. Certain chemical compounds remain restricted to licensed facilities because improper handling creates public safety hazards. Sensitive biological research operates under strict oversight specifically because premature release could harm populations. Treating sealed chambers as hazardous materials that require proper preparation and safety protocols isn't suppression, it's responsible stewardship. The timing protocol makes sense from a safety perspective if astronomical or geological conditions affect chamber contents. Electromagnetic fields vary with solar activity and Earth's magnetic field fluctuations. Seismic activity follows patterns that could affect structural stability. Atmospheric composition changes with seasonal and climate variations. If these factors influence what's inside chambers, making them more or less dangerous depending on current conditions, then waiting for optimal conditions isn't superstition. It's sensible risk management based on observable patterns. The fundamental safety argument is pragmatic. Sealed chambers have remained sealed for thousands of years. They're not going anywhere. Whatever is inside has waited this long. It can wait longer. Better to develop technology and protocols that minimize risk than rush in and create casualties or unleash something we can't control. Better to err on the side of caution when dealing with ancient systems we don't fully understand and that have already proven capable of killing or permanently damaging people. This position has legitimacy that deserves acknowledgement. People have died. Psychological damage is real. Unknown biological agents exist. Equipment malfunctions occur consistently. Even rejecting supernatural explanations, genuine physical and psychological hazards are present in sealed chambers. The question isn't whether they're dangerous, they clearly are. The question is whether danger justifies permanent sealing versus controlled exploration with appropriate safety measures. From the safety perspective, the answer is clear. Explore eventually with proper preparation. Not never, but not now. Not until we understand what we're dealing with and have technology and protocols that protect both explorers and whatever knowledge or materials the chambers preserve. The safety argument makes sense for dangerous spaces, but it doesn't explain why completely stable, analyzed chambers remain sealed. It doesn't explain Vatican involvement or coordination across countries. It doesn't explain why chambers predicted to be safe for opening remain unopened even after calculated safe dates pass. Safety is part of the story, but there's more. If sealed chambers prove advanced civilization existed 12,000 years ago, the implications extend far beyond archaeology textbooks. It undermines religious creation timelines that place human civilization within the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. It raises questions about what knowledge was lost and why. It challenges the narrative of continuous human progress from primitive to advanced. Academic careers built on specific theoretical frameworks would face crisis. Religious institutions whose authority rests on scriptural accounts would face challenges to their historical accuracy. National identity myths, built on being among humanity's first civilizations, would require revision. Power structures are invested in current narratives. Academic departments receive funding based on established theoretical frameworks about human development. Professors achieve tenure, defending specific interpretations of history. Entire fields of study rest on assumptions about when certain capabilities emerged in human civilization. Discoveries that prove those assumptions wrong don't just require updating textbooks. They invalidate decades of scholarship and threaten institutional credibility. Religious institutions face even higher stakes. If sealed chambers contain alternative accounts of human origin, consciousness, or cosmology that contradict scriptural narratives, the implications threaten theological authority that has been maintained for millennia. The Vatican's specific interest in sealed chambers makes perfect sense from this perspective. If chambers contain information about religious practices that informed Christianity but preceded it, or reveal that biblical accounts were influenced by earlier traditions that Christianity claimed to supersede, the Church's historical narrative faces fundamental questions. Modern nation-states base significant identity and economic activity on specific historical narratives. Egypt's national pride and massive tourist industry depend on narratives about pharaonic civilization being indigenous, achievement representing the pinnacle of ancient knowledge. Discoveries suggesting Egyptian civilization inherited rather than originated its knowledge, or that predynastic peoples were more advanced than the pharaonic period, undermine both national identity and economic interests. The Egyptian government has clear incentives to control how such information emerges, if it emerges at all. If sealed chambers reveal connections between ancient cultures suggesting global civilization or knowledge networks, they undermine nationalist narratives about independent cultural development. The idea that ancient peoples crossed oceans, shared knowledge, and cooperated on projects requiring coordination across continents contradicts histories built on isolated development and cultural superiority theories that inform modern politics and racial ideologies. Proof of ancient globalism would demand re-evaluating assumptions about human cooperation, knowledge transmission, and civilizational capability. If chambers contain advanced technology, functional devices, or detailed technical documentation, it proves ancient peoples had capabilities exceeding current assumptions. This creates a psychologically and politically destabilizing realization that humanity might have been more advanced thousands of years ago than we are now in certain domains. The narrative of continuous progress from primitive to advanced, which justifies modern institutions and technological control systems, collapses under evidence that progress isn't linear and advancement can be lost. The most cynical possibility deserves consideration. Authorities know exactly what's in sealed chambers and suppress it specifically because the knowledge would disrupt current power structures. Those who control technology control society. Those who control historical narrative control legitimacy. If sealed chambers contain information about energy generation, consciousness, manipulation, biological enhancement, or longevity developments that would render current economic and power structures obsolete, those who benefit from current systems have clear incentives to prevent access. Historical precedent demonstrates institutional suppression of disruptive knowledge. The Catholic Church resisted heliocentrism for centuries because Earth's cosmic demotion threatened theological frameworks about humanity's special status. Ottoman authorities suppressed Greek archaeological discoveries because they contradicted Islamic historical narratives about the region. Soviet authorities rewrote historical accounts to align with ideological requirements. Power structures consistently suppress information that undermines their authority, not necessarily from malice, but from institutional self-preservation instinct. Truth ultimately serves humanity better than comfortable lies. Knowledge suppression always eventually fails, as information finds ways to spread despite restrictions. But suppression can delay change long enough for current power holders to maintain control for another generation or century. That delay might be precisely the point. Not permanent suppression, but temporary control over the timing and framing of revelations that will eventually emerge regardless of restrictions. The coordination between multiple institutions, academic, religious, governmental, all maintaining similar restrictions on sealed chambers, suggests shared recognition that what's inside threatens multiple power structures simultaneously. Not conspiracy in the sense of explicit coordination, but parallel interests arriving at the same conclusion: that sealed chambers contain information better kept sealed until those in power can control how it's released and interpreted. If sealed chambers prove advanced civilization existed 12,000 years ago, it doesn't just rewrite history textbooks. It undermines religious creation stories, national origin myths, racial superiority theories, and every power structure built on controlling humanity's understanding of its past. How many institutions would fight to prevent that? All of them. Safety concerns are real. Control motivations are real. But there's a third possibility that might explain why sealed chambers stay sealed. What if authorities are actually preparing to open them? What if all this restriction is temporary, not permanent? What if they're waiting for the right conditions not to protect us from what's inside, but to ensure what's inside is still intact when we finally access it? The increased scanning and documentation of sealed chambers in recent decades suggests something other than permanent avoidance. Authorities are methodically mapping what's inside using non-invasive technology, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, electromagnetic surveys, acoustic analysis. This work would be pointless if they never intended to explore. You don't spend decades and millions of dollars mapping spaces you plan to keep sealed forever. You map them because you're preparing to enter them and want to know what you're dealing with before you do. Archaeological technology development over the past 30 years shows specific focus on capabilities suited for sensitive sealed sites. Remote sensing that provides detailed interior imaging without entry. Micro-drilling that allows atmospheric sampling through holes smaller than a pencil. Robotic exploration systems that can navigate confined spaces while transmitting real-time data. Preservation techniques that stabilize materials immediately upon exposure to prevent degradation. These aren't general-purpose tools. They're specialized equipment designed for exactly the kind of challenges sealed chambers present. International cooperation agreements around sensitive archaeological sites have been quietly established over the past 2 decades. Protocols for joint exploration, standards for documentation, agreements about artifact custody and information sharing. This level of coordination takes years to negotiate and only makes sense if parties anticipate actually using these agreements for future exploration rather than permanent restriction. Leaked references to timing calculations and horizon dates suggest authorities believe there are optimal times for chamber access. Not arbitrary dates, but calculated windows based on astronomical alignments, geological conditions, or technological readiness criteria. Some of these dates have allegedly already passed. Others are approaching in the near future. The fact that past dates didn't result in immediate public exploration doesn't necessarily mean the timing theory is wrong. It might mean other criteria weren't yet satisfied, or that planned exploration occurred quietly without public announcement. What would waiting for the right time actually mean? Waiting for technology advanced enough to explore safely without destroying what's inside. Waiting for astronomical alignments that ancient inscriptions specify as appropriate for chamber access. Waiting for social and political conditions stable enough to handle potentially disruptive discoveries without triggering conflict or panic. Waiting for environmental conditions, magnetic field states, solar activity levels, seismic patterns that ancient builders might have understood make chambers safe to enter. The most optimistic interpretation is that sealed chambers will be opened systematically once proper protocols and preparedness are established. That current restrictions are temporary measures, ensuring future exploration success rather than permanent suppression. That authorities recognize the value of what might be inside and want to maximize knowledge gain while minimizing danger and damage. What would need to change for chambers to be opened? Technological advances are already progressing. International agreements are being negotiated. Personnel might be training quietly in programs that aren't publicly acknowledged. Public consciousness might be deliberately prepared through mainstream alternative history content, becoming more acceptable, preparing collective awareness for revelations that would have seemed impossible to discuss seriously a generation ago. What if authorities aren't keeping chambers sealed forever? What if they're preparing developing technology, establishing protocols, training teams, calculating optimal timing? What if everything we've seen is preparation for opening them properly? The documents reference horizon dates. Some have already passed, others are coming soon. They're not trying to keep the doors sealed. They're trying to be ready when they open them. We began with a discovery in 2015, a newly opened chamber beneath an Egyptian temple that was sealed again within 48 hours. Workers who entered experienced disorientation. Equipment malfunctioned. Authorities classified the location and denied all subsequent access requests. That single incident led us through a labyrinth of sealed spaces, ancient warnings, and modern mysteries that span the globe and reach back thousands of years into humanity's forgotten past. We explored the 7 most famous sealed Egyptian chambers. The Osiris Shaft, with its flooded levels and granite sarcophagus too large to have been brought through existing passages. The Sphinx chamber, detected by ground-penetrating radar, in exactly the location predicted by psychic Edgar Cayce decades before the technology existed to confirm it. The Serapeum sarcophagi weighing 70 tons each, carved from single blocks of granite with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The Great Pyramid's hidden chambers that scanning technology reveals, but authorities refuse to excavate. The Abydos subterranean complex, where multiple scanning methods detect chambers that shouldn't exist in the same physical space. The Karnak restricted zone, where workers report temporal anomalies and equipment failures. The Giza deep chambers, 400 feet below the surface, well below the water table, yet scans indicate they're not flooded spaces that make no archaeological sense and appear in no historical text. We examined the deaths. At least 17 documented fatalities from entering sealed chambers over the past century. Some died immediately from environmental hazards, toxic gases, structural collapse, exposure to unknown substances. Others died slowly from psychological deterioration they never recovered from. We examined the survivors who emerged permanently changed, speaking dead languages they'd only studied academically, drawing maps of undiscovered chambers with perfect accuracy, aging years in hours, according to medical documentation, that has no explanation for how such rapid biological change could occur. We analysed ancient warnings that proved disturbingly accurate, inscriptions that specified dangers in precise technical language rather than religious metaphor, references to those who sleep without breathing, and knowledge that consumes the unprepared, instructions for preparation protocols involving psychological conditioning, astronomical timing, and physical arrangements in specific geometric patterns. Warnings that were dismissed as superstition until modern explorers experienced exactly what ancient texts described: disorientation, temporal confusion, consciousness alteration, and death for those who entered without following prescribed procedures. We revealed what modern scanning technology shows inside sealed chambers. Impossible geometries like the Fibonacci spiral beneath Saqqara, mathematical precision that ancient Egyptians supposedly never formalized. Chambers at depths where flooding should be inevitable but scans show empty space. Overlapping chambers at Abydos that appear to occupy the same physical location depending on scanning frequency used. Electromagnetic fields that suggest active power generation from sources sealed for thousands of years. Shapes consistent with technological devices rather than religious artifacts or burial goods. We uncovered Vatican involvement through leaked documents, proving the Catholic Church maintains veto power over Egyptian archaeological discoveries through a 1929 agreement that specifically mentions pre-dynastic chambers and theological contradictions. We discovered Vatican archives contain centuries of documentation about sealed chambers, including first-person accounts from medieval explorers who described experiences matching modern reports exactly. We found leaked emails referencing timing protocols and suggestions that chambers should remain sealed until celestial and terrestrial conditions align, language indicating coordinated planning based on astronomical calculations and readiness criteria that someone is tracking systematically. We explored theories about what sealed chambers contain, the Hall of Records hypothesis suggesting comprehensive knowledge from lost civilizations preserved in formats we're only beginning to understand. The preservation theory proposing biological or semi-biological entities in suspended states, supported by DNA analysis, finding genetic material too complex to be contamination but matching no known organism. The technology theory examining electromagnetic readings, descriptions of devices, and engineering precision, suggesting functional ancient technology that remains active after millennia. Each theory is supported by specific evidence that can't be easily dismissed, even if complete proof remains elusive. We heard from survivors who entered sealed chambers and lived to describe it. Dr. Margaret Holbrook, who emerged speaking fluent Middle Egyptian and drawing architectural plans for chambers, discovered decades later in locations she specified. Sarah Chen, who aged years in 6 hours, according to medical documentation showing telomere shortening and biological markers that shouldn't change so rapidly. The unnamed Egyptian worker, who encountered someone else in a sealed chamber and developed symptoms resembling severe PTSD, combined with linguistic changes his family insisted weren't his own personality. And the prepared explorers like Father Alessandro Rossi, who followed ancient protocols and emerged with practical knowledge, surgical techniques still used today, that he attributed entirely to chamber experience rather than conventional study. We discovered this isn't an Egyptian peculiarity, but a global phenomenon. China's Longyu caves, with precision-carved chambers at impossible depths. Malta's hypogeum, with acoustic properties, engineered to affect human consciousness through specific sound frequencies. Japan's submerged Yonaguni monument with sealed doorways authorities refused to breach. Peru and Bolivia's pre-Columbian temples, with underground chambers sealed by the Catholic Church and never reopened. Ground-penetrating radar detecting similar sealed chambers beneath major ancient sites worldwide. Angkor Wat, Machu Picchu. Easter Island, with exploration permits consistently denied using remarkably similar official justifications across different countries and cultures. We examined the cycle theory, connecting sealed chambers to catastrophic Earth changes on 12,000-year timelines. Evidence that many chambers were sealed at approximately the same historical moment around the end of the last ice age, when comet impacts triggered massive climate disruption. Ancient texts from cultures worldwide describing repeating cycles of creation and destruction with suspiciously consistent intervals. Modern scientific confirmation of cyclical Earth changes, including magnetic pole reversals, solar activity patterns, and galactic orbital variations. The disturbing possibility that sealed chambers were designed not just to preserve knowledge from the last catastrophe, but for the next one, and that we're approaching the completion of the current cycle. We analysed why authorities maintain restrictions. The legitimate safety argument acknowledging real dangers that have caused documented deaths and injuries. The control motivation, recognising that sealed chambers might contain information undermining religious doctrines, historical narratives, and power structures built on controlling humanity's understanding of its past. And the preparation theory suggesting restrictions might be temporary, while authorities develop technology, establish protocols, and calculate optimal timing for eventual systematic exploration rather than permanent suppression. Here's what we know for certain. Sealed chambers exist in Egypt and worldwide. They're dangerous in documented, measurable ways. Ancient warnings about these dangers were accurate. Modern authorities across multiple countries maintain coordinated restrictions using similar justifications. Scanning technology has revealed aspects of these chambers that violate known physics or archaeology. Some people who entered experienced transformative effects that can't be explained by conventional psychology or biology. We know enough to confirm this isn't simple archaeology. Something genuinely unusual and significant is happening with these spaces. Here's what remains unknown. What exactly is inside that justifies such extreme measures spanning decades and involving coordination between governments, religious institutions, and academic authorities? Whether ancient technology or comprehensive knowledge is actually preserved in formats we can access and understand. Whether biological entities or consciousness-preserving systems remain functional after millennia. What the relationship is between Egyptian chambers and similar sites, worldwide shared knowledge system, common purpose, or parallel independent development. Whether ancient cycle theories about repeating catastrophes have merit or are metaphorical interpretations of irregular disasters. What authorities' actual plans are for future exploration, and whether calculated opening dates are real or disinformation. We don't have complete answers. Genuine mysteries shouldn't pretend to definitive conclusions, but we have enough information to know the official narrative doesn't match documented facts. We have enough evidence to confirm something extraordinary is being restricted from public knowledge. We have enough testimony from credible witnesses to take these chambers seriously, rather than dismissing them as archaeological curiosities or debunked conspiracy theories. You've heard the evidence, you've seen the theories, you've examined the testimonies. So what do you believe? Are sealed chambers dangerous sites best left alone until we develop adequate safety protocols and understanding? Are they time capsules from lost civilizations waiting for humanity to reach a developmental threshold that allows safe access? Are they locks on knowledge or technology that would disrupt current power structures suppressed not for our protection, but for the protection of those who benefit from current systems? Are they preservation systems connected to cosmic cycles we're only beginning to recognize, designed to be opened at specific times for specific purposes by people prepared in specific ways? Whatever you believe, stay curious. Question official explanations that don't align with documented evidence. Support transparency in archaeological research, and demand justification when authorities restrict access to discoveries that could expand human knowledge. Watch for announcements about sealed chamber exploration, because it will happen eventually, whether through official channels or through leaks and unauthorized access. And when it happens, pay attention not just to what's revealed, but to what remains carefully unspoken in official statements. Right now, beneath Egypt's sand and beneath sites around the world, sealed chambers wait in darkness just as they have for thousands of years. Inside them is something ancient Egyptians considered worth preserving at any cost and dangerous enough to seal against casual discovery. Something that can transfer knowledge directly to consciousness or age people in hours or kill within minutes. Something that survives on radar scans but defies physical laws as we understand them. Something that the most powerful institutions on Earth agree should remain hidden, at least for now. The chambers are waiting. The question is, what happens when we finally stop waiting with them? What happens when the doors open? Maybe we'll find answers to humanity's deepest questions about our origins, our potential, and our future. Maybe we'll find technology that revolutionizes civilization and solves problems we've struggled with for generations. Maybe we'll find proof of cycles that explain both our past and our future knowledge that ancient peoples preserved specifically for us to find at this moment in history. Or maybe we'll find something we're not ready for. Something ancient Egyptians sealed away for very good reasons we're about to learn the hard way. Something that was meant to stay sealed until humanity reached a level of wisdom and capability we haven't yet achieved. Something that will force us to confront uncomfortable truths about who we are, where we came from, and what we're capable of becoming. Whatever's behind those sealed doors has waited thousands of years in absolute darkness. Soon, maybe in our lifetime, maybe in the next decade, we're going to find out if they should have stayed sealed forever. 7 sealed chambers in Egypt, hundreds more worldwide, ancient warnings that prove accurate, modern technology showing impossibilities, people dying or transforming when they enter, authorities coordinating global suppression. Something is in those chambers, something important enough to kill for, important enough to lie about, important enough to seal for thousands of years, and possibly important enough that we're almost ready, whether we want to be or not, to finally see what ancient civilizations left waiting for us in the dark.